Welcome to this Soundscape Books recording of The Sovereign Word, a dystopian sci-fi novel by Vivian Black, presented as an exclusive audiobook. Like and subscribe for more. Enjoy.
The Sovereign Word. Chapter 1, The Blizzard's Embrace. The wind howled a primordial dirge against the sheer, unyielding face of the perimeter wall, a sound that had become a constant, unwelcome companion to Peter Green. It carried with it needles of ice, scouring the thick, reinforced synth-steel panels and whipping the snow into a maelstrom of white. Inside his heavily insulated suit, Peter shivered, a tremor that had less to do with the biting cold and more with the marrow-deep weariness of his existence. He was on patrol, as he always was, a cog in the meticulously calibrated machinery of the Belogorsk corporate enclave. This stretch of the wall, a desolate expanse on the northern frontier, was his dominion for the next 4 hours. His steps were rote, imprinted by countless patrols, each echoing the last in its bleak, monotonous rhythm. The only variations were the shifting patterns of the blizzard, sometimes a blinding whiteout, sometimes a brief, treacherous lull that revealed the stark, unforgiving landscape beyond the wall. Above him, the automated turrets, silent sentinels of the Ethelberg conglomerate, tracked invisible threats with cold, unblinking lenses. Their infrared beams painted fleeting, ephemeral lines across the swirling snow, their presence a constant, chilling reminder of the rules. The rules were simple, inviolable, no unauthorized entry, no deviation from protocol, no independent thought. Every action, every breath was monitored by the sensory grids embedded in the wall itself, feeding data back to a central command that saw all, knew all, judged all. Peter's internal monologue was a familiar refrain, a quiet rebellion against the crushing weight of the system. Another night, another blizzard, another stretch of empty wall. He was a trainee, just out of the academy, still raw with the ideals they'd tried to drill out of him, the ones that spoke of a human element, of judgment beyond algorithms. But here, on the wall, there was no room for such thoughts. His breath plumed white, instantly lost to the gale. He adjusted the strap of his standard-issue energy rifle, its weight a familiar anchor in the swirling chaos. The rifle was as much a symbol of his duty as it was a tool, a constant reminder of the grim purpose he was being trained for: to protect the enclave, to protect the conglomerate, to protect the cold, hard logic of their world. He paused by a junction box, checking the integrity of a sensor array, his fingers stiff inside his thermal gloves. The blizzard was intensifying, pushing visibility down to a few meters. He could barely make out the faint, pulsing blue of the energy field that hummed along the wall's crest, a final, lethal deterrent against any who might try to breach Belogorsk's sanctity. He wondered, idly, what kind of fool would even attempt such a thing on a night like this. The cold itself was a weapon, far more insidious than any laser grid. It seeped into bones, numbed senses, and stole the will to live. The solitude was absolute, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the faint hum of the wall's machinery. Peter often found himself talking to himself out here, not out loud, but in a silent conversation that kept the deeper, more unsettling silence at bay. He thought of the warm, sterile barracks he would return to, the tasteless nutrient paste, the identical bunks, the hushed whispers of his fellow trainees. Life in Belogorsk was a controlled experiment, every variable accounted for, every risk mitigated. And he, Peter Green, was one of the variables struggling against the data, against the programming. Suddenly, a flicker on his visor's low-light optics. Not the random swirl of snow, but a distinct, non-organic shape. He froze, hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. Protocol screamed at him, report, engage, neutralize. His training took over, his stance widening, weapon raising. But something was off. The shape wasn't moving. It was slumped, almost fetal, against a particularly deep drift near a rarely used service gate, a gate that was supposed to be sealed, impenetrable. Peter lowered his rifle a fraction, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. This wasn't a breach attempt, not like this. No one would scale the wall only to collapse at its base. The figure was too still, too small against the monumental backdrop of the wall. He edged closer, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to follow the rules, to radio it in and let the automated drones handle it. The enclave had no mercy for intruders, especially not in the depths of a blizzard. They were simply variables to be eliminated. As he drew nearer, the blizzard relented for a fleeting moment, as if to offer a clearer view. What he saw made his breath catch. It was a man, huddled against the wall, half buried in a fresh snowdrift. His clothes, what Peter could see of them beneath the crust of ice, were ragged, thin, utterly inadequate for the extreme cold. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain, almost black against the white snow, seeped from beneath his head. He was shivering violently, body convulsing in the grip of hypothermia, but the movements were weakening, slowing. He was dying. Peter's internal debate was a brutal, instantaneous war. His training, years of it, roared in his mind: threat, unidentified, breach of perimeter, report, do not engage alone, do not compromise position, do not assist. His community felt heavy, an accusation in his hand. One press of a button and the situation would be out of his hands, handled by the cold, efficient machinery of the conglomerate. The man would be gone, a statistic, another unfortunate soul swallowed by the unforgiving outside. But then another voice, quieter, older, clearer than the corporate dogma, spoke to him. It was the voice of the man he used to be before the academy, before Belogorsk. It spoke of common decency, of the simple, undeniable truth of human suffering. The man on the ground was not a threat, he was a victim. He was freezing to death, alone in the most desolate place Peter had ever known. Peter dropped to one knee, the crunch of his boots on the packed snow loud in the howling wind. The man's face was gaunt, etched with pain and exhaustion, his lips blue, eyes fluttering open weakly, meeting Peter's gaze. There was no defiance in those eyes, no menace, only a profound, primal weariness. And in that fleeting connection, Peter saw not an intruder but a person suffering. "Hey," Peter rasped, his voice rough against the wind. The man didn't respond, only shivered harder. His breath was shallow, ragged. Peter knew he had minutes, maybe less. His thick, corporate-tissued storm coat was a heavy, warm sanctuary against the blizzard. He didn't hesitate. With a decisive tug, he unfastened the clasps, shrugging out of the heavy garment. The blast of cold against his thinner undersuit was immediate, shocking, but he ignored it. He spread the coat over the man, tucking it tightly around his shoulders, trying to funnel what little warmth he had left into the failing body. The man's eyes flickered open again, wider this time, surprised. A faint grunt escaped his lips, a sound of weak protest or perhaps dawning comprehension. Peter met his gaze, holding it, letting his own desperation and strange, quiet resolve transmit across the short distance. There was a shared moment, profound and wordless, an understanding forged in the heart of the storm. Peter saw a flicker of something in the man's eyes, not gratitude, not yet, but a raw, unyielding will, a spirit that even the blizzard couldn't extinguish. This was no ordinary drifter. Peter leaned closer, shouting over the wind, "Can you move? We need to get you out of this." The man tried to nod, a barely perceptible tremor of his head. He tried to speak, but only a dry cough rattled in his chest. His good hand, trembling, reached out not for Peter, but for the heavy corporate coat Peter had wrapped him in. It was a silent acknowledgement, a desperate clasp for the warmth. The service gate was old, rarely used, a relic from the enclave's early construction days. It was marked with rusted signage, restricted access, maintenance only. But its true function as an emergency escape route was almost forgotten by modern security protocols, replaced by the belief that the perimeter was impregnable. Peter knew about it only because his father, a longtime maintenance engineer, had pointed it out years ago, a whisper of old knowledge passed down before he, too, was assimilated into the conglomerate's structure. "This way," Peter urged, pulling the man upright, supporting most of his weight. The man groaned but pushed himself forward, leaning heavily on Peter. The coat Peter had given him was a temporary reprieve, but his body was a dead weight, stiff with cold. Peter fumbled with his belt, retrieving a temporary access pass, a standard trainee issue that allowed limited passage through internal service tunnels. It wouldn't open main gates, but this forgotten service gate had a simpler, older lock mechanism, one that recognized a broader range of authorized credentials. It was a risk, a monumental, career-ending risk, but Peter's conviction solidified with every painful, staggering step. He pressed the card to the reader beside the service gate. There was a faint whirring sound, a green light flashed, and the heavy metal door, stiff with disuse, slowly hissed open. Inside, a narrow, dark maintenance tunnel stretched into the gloom, smelling of damp earth and old grease. "Go down here," Peter instructed, his voice low and urgent. "Follow the main pipe. It comes out almost a kilometer west of the main residential sector. There's an old water conduit that exits into the forest, nearly 3 clicks from the perimeter." No one monitors it. The man, still leaning on Peter, looked at him again, his gaze piercing despite the exhaustion. He seemed to understand the gravity of Peter's actions, the sheer defiance of giving aid and an escape route to an unknown figure. He didn't speak, but a flicker of something passed between them, a silent promise, an unspoken acknowledgement of a debt incurred. Peter didn't know the man's name or why he was here, half dead in the blizzard, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Only the stark, undeniable truth of one human helping another. With a final, desperate surge of strength, the man pulled himself free of Peter's grasp, clutching the heavy coat around him. He turned and stumbled into the darkness of the tunnel, swallowed instantly by the gloom and the swirling snow that tried to follow him in. The door hissed shut, sealing him away, leaving only Peter standing in the swirling white void, the blizzard tearing at his thinner undersuit. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than the roar of the wind, punctuated only by Peter's ragged breaths. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. He stood for a long moment, staring at the closed service gate, the ghost of the man's desperate gaze lingering in his mind. He was alone again, but the world felt different now. Something had shifted, a silent earthquake beneath the rigid foundation of his life. He turned, the wind whipping his hair, and began the long, cold walk back to the security barracks. The blizzard raged, obliterating his footprints almost as soon as he made them. He was leaving no trace, no evidence of his defiance, a fact that both comforted and unnerved him. Back in his barracks, the air was warm, sterile, and still. The identical bunks, the unadorned walls, the low hum of the air recyclers, it was all designed for efficiency, for control, for the suppression of individuality. Peter shed his snow-crusted outer gear, hanging his now missing storm coat, the empty space a stark void in his locker. He pulled off his gloves, his fingers aching with the lingering cold. He sat on the edge of his bunk, the synthetic mattress cold beneath him. He was tired, bone-tired, but sleep felt a million miles away. His mind replayed the scene at the wall. The man's desperate eyes, the heavy feel of the coat as he'd removed it, the whisper of the tunnel door closing. He had broken every rule. He had endangered his career, perhaps even his freedom. If internal security, if Alex Shaverin ever found out, the thought sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Shaverin was a hawk, a true believer in the conglomerate's absolute authority, and he had an uncanny knack for sniffing out deviation. Peter walked away from the barracks, the blizzard's chill still clinging to him, yet a deeper cold had settled in his bones. It was the icy certainty of irreversible change, a consequence born from an act of quiet defiance. He had indeed found a sliver of unexpected humanity in the storm, but in doing so, he had thrown a stone into the placid, controlled waters of the enclave. The ripples, Peter knew with a certainty that settled deep in his heart, would surely reach him. He could not, however, have foreseen the sheer force those ripples would gather, nor the season in which they would break. For winter's icy embrace would yield not to the gentle thaw of spring, but to a torrent of fire and chaos. The quiet debt forged in the snow would soon be called, not in the hushed corridors of authority, but amidst the screams and thunder of a city tearing itself apart. Belogorsk's fragile peace, and the lives within it, were about to shatter. Chapter 2. The Spring Offensive. Spring arrived in Belogorsk not with the gentle whisper of melting snow, but with a roar that tore through the dawn. Months had passed since Peter's quiet defiance in the blizzard, and now the ripples he'd foreseen had crashed upon the enclave's pristine shores like a tidal wave of shrapnel and screams. Explosions rocked the perimeter, sending columns of smoke spiraling into the pale morning sky, while the synchronized pop of suppressed gunfire echoed from within the residential sectors. The Ethelberg conglomerate's meticulously curated peace, a placid facade over a tightly controlled existence, shattered in an instant, revealing the raw, violent machinery of rebellion. On the main arterial, once so sterile and predictable, armored corporate security vehicles lay overturned, burning with oily black smoke that stained the pre-dawn light. Gunfire erupted in sharp, staccato bursts, mingling with the panicked shouts of civilians jolted awake by the sudden onslaught. Rebel fighters, moving with a chilling precision Peter could only attribute to extensive training and intimate knowledge of the enclave's layout, swarmed through access points previously thought impregnable. They wore utilitarian gray uniforms, devoid of corporate insignia, and moved with a purpose that corporate security, for all their discipline, seemed utterly incapable of matching. Peter, still in his security uniform, found himself herded with other disarmed personnel into a secure courtyard near the main administrative core. His pulse throbbed against his temples, a frantic drumbeat against the distant booms that continued to shake the ground. He watched, numb and yet acutely aware, as the freeborn rebels, led by a stocky, efficient man with a grim set to his jaw whom he recognized as Cale from security briefings, systematically cleared buildings. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. This was a surgical strike, executed with devastating efficiency. The air crackled with the metallic tang of cordite and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Sirens, once the familiar soundtrack of the enclave, now wailed in a frantic, desperate crescendo, quickly dying out as communication lines were severed. Belogorsk, once a fortress, was bleeding. Miles away, nestled deeper within the residential sector, Mary Miller's apartment was usually a haven of quiet order. But that morning, it became a terrifying echo chamber for the war outside. The first explosion had thrown her from her bed. The second had shattered the window facing the quad. Her father, Thomas, a man whose gentle hands usually coaxed life from stubborn circuitry, had immediately pulled her towards the reinforced core of their building, a small, windowless utility closet. "Stay low, Mary," Thomas's voice, usually calm and resonant, was tight with urgency. He was older, his hair a distinguished silver, but his movements were surprisingly agile as he pulled a heavy maintenance hatch closed, sealing them into a space barely big enough for two. The muffled sounds of the battle raged around them, the terrifying clang of heavy boots on the polished floors of the hallway, the sharp crack of plasma fire, and then the chilling, guttural shouts of men. "What's happening, Papa?" Mary whispered, pressing herself against his side, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a woman of routine, of logic, of predictable days spent in data analysis. This raw, visceral chaos was an alien terror. "Rebels, I think," Thomas murmured, his hand tightening around hers. He peered through a narrow slit in the hatch, his face illuminated by the eerie flickering light from the hallway outside. "They're pushing through fast." A violent crash from outside ripped through the momentary quiet, followed by the shriek of tearing metal. The building shuddered, and a section of the hallway wall just outside their closet ruptured, showering the corridor with debris. A stray, burning piece of shrapnel, hot and jagged, spun through the gaping hole. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas threw himself forward, shielding Mary with his own body. Mary felt the impact more than she saw it, a sickening thud, a ragged gasp from her father. He crumpled forward, his weight pressing her back against the wall. The acrid smell of burned fabric and something else, something metallic and warm, filled the tiny space. "Papa!" she screamed, scrambling to push him back to see. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she rolled him gently. He lay half-propped against the wall, his eyes wide, fixed on something unseen. A dark, rapidly expanding stain blossomed on the side of his old work jacket over his ribs. "Mary!" His voice was a ragged whisper, a mere thread of sound. His eyes, though wide, seemed to struggle to focus on her. "My girl, be brave." A cough racked his body, bringing a fresh surge of dark liquid to his lips. "No, Papa, no, you're going to be okay." Tears streamed down Mary's face, hot and blinding. She pressed her hands against the wound, futilely trying to stem the flow, but the blood seeped between her fingers, warm and sticky. The sounds of fighting outside began to recede, moving further down the corridor, but Mary barely registered it. Her world had shrunk to this small, utility closet, to the rasp of her father's shallow breaths, to the terrifying silence that now threatened to envelop them both. Thomas's hand, cold and heavy, reached up, his fingers weakly brushing her cheek. "My bright star, always?" His gaze drifted, then unfocused. His breath hitched, a final, rattling sigh, and then a devastating stillness. His eyes, still open, stared blankly past her, into a future he would never share. Mary let out a choked cry, a sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. She cradled his head, pulling his lifeless form closer, rocking back and forth, the cold metal of the closet wall against her back, the warmth of his cooling body the only anchor in a world that had just been ripped apart. Grief, raw and absolute, consumed her, a black tide that threatened to drown her utterly. The chaos outside might have paused, but inside her, a storm of unprecedented magnitude had just begun. Hours later, the residential sector was eerily quiet, the dust settling like a shroud over the shattered peace. The sounds of sporadic gunfire were distant now, signaling a perimeter being established, not a chaotic advance. Elias Cole's freeborn squad had secured the sector, systematically disarming the remaining corporate security personnel and establishing order amongst the traumatized residents. Peter, still among the disarmed security, had been moved from the courtyard to a communal area in the residential sector. A large lounge normally used for corporate social functions, now crowded with weary, defeated corporate personnel and a scattering of confused civilians. He sat on the floor, his uniform rumpled, watching the rebels move with an unsettling blend of professionalism and casual authority. This was a new order, utterly unlike the rigid structure he had known. The lounge doors swung open and Elias Cole entered. He moved with an innate gravitas, a man whose presence filled a space without needing to assert it. His face, though marked with the grime of battle and a faint bruise along his jawline, held a compelling intensity. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp and assessing, moving over each disarmed officer, each bewildered civilian. His gaze, dark and penetrating, paused, then sharpened, locking onto Peter. Peter felt a jolt run through him, a mixture of recognition and dread. This was the man from the blizzard. This was the stranger he had saved. Cole's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, acknowledgement, crossed his features. Cole raised a hand, a silent signal that immediately brought Cale, who had just entered behind him, to a halt. Cale, a man who gave no quarter, looked surprised but instantly obeyed. Cole's authority was absolute. Cole began to walk, not towards Peter but towards the back of the lounge, where a small huddle of rebels stood around something unseen. As he approached, the rebels stepped aside, revealing Mary Miller, still cradling her father's body. She was a tableau of utter devastation, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. The sight sent a fresh wave of quiet sorrow through Peter. He had seen Mary around the enclave, a meticulous and quiet analyst. Now she was broken. Cole knelt beside Mary, his voice, when he spoke, surprisingly soft, yet resonant enough to carry through the hushed room. "Daughter of Thomas Miller," he said, his gaze fixed on Mary's vacant eyes. "I am Elias Cole." Mary didn't respond, her grip on her father's cooling hand unwavering. She seemed locked in a private hell of grief. Cole continued, his voice steady. "Your father was a man of quiet integrity. And your life, by extension, is owed a debt." He paused, then looked up, his gaze sweeping over the disarmed Peter Green before returning to Mary. "A debt incurred by a selfless act, an act of kindness shown to me when I was at my lowest, by one whose compassion defied the dictates of the conglomerate. That debt extends to those touched by such a heart." He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden token, smooth, dark, and warm from his hand. It depicted a stylized, flowing symbol that resembled both a river and an unfurling leaf. "This," Cole said, holding it out to Mary, "is the mark of protection. It signifies my word, my personal guarantee against harm, so long as you uphold what I ask." Mary's gaze flickered to the token, then to Cole's face, a flicker of something akin to confusion breaking through the fog of her grief. "I ask for a contract, Mary Miller," Cole continued, his voice taking on a more formal but still gentle tone. "A contract of consent, This is the cornerstone of the freeborn's vision. It demands radical honesty, clear boundaries, and the right for either party to end everything with a single word. He extended the token again. You accept, and you are bound by these terms. You choose a word, a single word that, if spoken, will sever all ties immediately and irrevocably. He watched her, his expression unreadable, waiting. The silence in the lounge was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of the pacified enclave. Peter watched, transfixed, the implication of Cole's words sinking in. This was not a tyrant's command, but a strange, unsettling proposal of freedom within captivity. Mary, numb with shock and grief, barely registered the full weight of his words. Her father's cold hand was still in hers, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Life under the conglomerate had dictated her choices, her movements, her very thoughts. Now, in the aftermath of utter destruction, a different kind of authority, one that offered a word of power, stood before her. It was a bizarre, incomprehensible offer in a moment of such profound vulnerability. But perhaps a tiny, desperate part of her reasoned, a contract with a word of ending was better than no control at all. Slowly, mechanically, her hand reached out, trembling, and closed around the smooth, warm wood of the mark of protection. Her fingers curled around it, clinging to its unfamiliar weight. "And your word?" Cole prompted, his voice calm. Mary swallowed, her throat dry, raw. The chaos, the fear, the crushing grief, it all blurred into a singular, overwhelming agony. What word could encompass this desolation, this desire for everything to simply stop? The pale morning sky overhead offered no solace, only the chilling clarity of a new dawn. The freeborn's spring offensive was over, its victory absolute, but the air in Belogorsk now hummed with a different kind of tension, heavier than any gunfire. Mary, still clutching the mark of protection, remained a statue of grief, bound by a contract she barely understood, the ink of her father's blood on its parchment a fresh stain. Peter, spared by an act of past kindness, felt the heavy, uncertain weight of this new regime begin to settle, a terrifying unknown taking root in the heart of their city. Yet, as the hours lengthened and the full implications of Cole's ascendancy began to unfurl, it became clear that the true battle for Belogorsk had only just begun. The mark of protection, intended to safeguard Mary, felt increasingly like the first link in a chain, binding her to the man whose forces had indirectly caused her deepest wound. While Elias Cole sought to establish his provisional government and impose a fragile peace, old shadows stirred in the city's quiet corners. Whispers of dissent, cultivated by unseen hands, began to cling to the new order like a creeping vine. The fragile implications of Mary's contract and her burgeoning, dangerous autonomy within its rigid terms hung poised on the precipice, promising to drag Belogorsk deeper into its terrifying, uncertain future. Chapter 3. The Contract's Chains. Weeks bled into months, but the chilling clarity of Belogorsk's new dawn had only deepened into a pervasive unease. Elias Cole's provisional government, though outwardly stable, had replaced the conglomerate's meticulous order with a different, more unsettling kind of control, where whispers of dissent now threaded through the fragile peace. For Mary Miller, however, the mark of protection and the contract of consent had proven less a shield and more a gilded cage, binding her to the administrative heart of the very regime that had claimed her father, each duty in the repurposed core another link in a chain she barely understood. The hum of the server racks, once the steady pulse of corporate efficiency, now felt like a low, perpetual thrum of protest. The administrative core, stripped of its gleaming corporate signage and sterile, uniform decor, had been repurposed with a raw, almost brutal efficiency. Makeshift partitions of salvaged metal and fabric divided vast open-plan offices into functional workspaces and communal areas. Old data terminals, surprisingly resilient, flickered with new, rudimentary freeborn interfaces. In the main assembly hall, once a grand atrium for corporate pronouncements, Elias Cole stood on a raised platform, addressing a diverse gathering of freeborn cadres and former corporate employees. His voice, calm and resonant, filled the space without the need for amplification. "We are not here to replace one tyranny with another," Cole began, his gaze sweeping over the faces, lingering briefly on Mary Miller, who stood stiffly among a cluster of assigned administrative personnel. The Ethelberg conglomerate built walls, both physical and ideological. We are tearing them down. Our aim is not control, but order. An order built on consent, on shared purpose, and on the unyielding truth of our collective humanity. Mary listened, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her posture a silent, rigid defiance. Her father was dead. His life, a quiet testament to her unwavering belief in the enclave's carefully constructed stability, had been extinguished in the very upheaval Cole now championed. What kind of consent was this? She wondered, born from the barrel of a gun and the shattering of her world. She saw the glimmers of hope in some faces, particularly among the younger freeborn, their eyes shining with revolutionary fervor. But she also saw the fear, the exhaustion, and the deep-seated skepticism in the former corporate loyalists, their shoulders slumped under the weight of an unfamiliar, uncertain future. Cole outlined his vision: new rationing systems designed for equity, public forums for grievances and proposals, a shift in resource allocation towards community needs rather than corporate profit. He spoke of accountability, of shared sacrifice, of rebuilding Belogorsk from the ground up, not as an enclave, but as a community. Mary, however, felt a dull ache behind her eyes. Dee spent the last weeks sorting through mountains of digital and physical records, organizing supply chains, cross-referencing personnel files for the new redeployment efforts. It was tedious, demanding work, yet strangely, Cole had insisted she be given access to sensitive data, placing a peculiar trust in her, or perhaps a peculiar form of subtle monitoring. Her mark of protection, a small, intricately carved wooden disc, felt heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of the debt Cole claimed to owe and the strange contract that bound her. After the assembly, Cole descended from the platform, his presence magnetic, drawing people towards him with questions and concerns. Freeborn members moved with a quiet authority, guiding people, answering queries, maintaining the new order. Mary, however, kept to the periphery, her grief a shroud around her. She watched Cole, how he listened patiently, how his responses were always measured, thoughtful. He wasn't the bombastic revolutionary she might have expected. He was quiet, calculating, and seemingly sincere in his revolutionary ideals, a dangerous combination that only deepened her resentment. He truly believed in this consent of his, and it infuriated her. A young freeborn officer, Cale, the same one who'd overseen the disarming of security personnel on the day of the takeover, approached her. "Miller, Commander Cole wants you to oversee the new agricultural data inputs. They're finding inefficiencies in the old corporate logs, and your attention to detail will be invaluable." Mary nodded curtly, her gaze still fixed on Cole, who was now engaged in an intense discussion with a group of engineers. Understood. The administrative role wasn't a punishment, not exactly. But it wasn't freedom either. It was a purpose, yes, but a controlled one. A way for Cole to keep her close, to keep her under his watchful, principled eye. Every file she sorted, every report she generated, felt less like contribution and more like an affirmation of her unwilling allegiance, a tightening of the contract's chains. Mary's new office was a former storage closet, crammed with repurposed terminals and stacks of paper files. It was small, isolated, and, in its own way, a haven. She preferred the solitude to the bustling main floor of the core, where the murmurs of the new administration often grated on her nerves. The endless data entry, however, was mind-numbing. One afternoon, a stern-faced freeborn procurement officer, a woman named Lena with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, entered without knocking. "Miller, the requisitions for the Eastern Sector's water filtration system are still pending. We need those cross-referenced with the reservoir levels by end of cycle." "What's the holdup?" Lena's voice was clipped, impatient, her frustration clearly aimed at what she perceived as sluggishness from a former corporate employee. Mary paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had been working on the filtration requisitions for hours, meticulously checking old corporate maintenance schedules against new freeborn supply forecasts, a task complicated by missing or corrupted data. Her head throbbed. Lena's tone, however, was the final straw. It was condescending, accusatory. Mary turned, her expression blank. The holdup, Lena, is that the previous data is incomplete, and your team's latest delivery manifest is missing 8 core components for the tertiary pump. I can't cross-reference what isn't here. Lena's brow furrowed. That's not my concern. Your job is to make it work. We have deadlines, Miller. Lives depend on this. She gestured dismissively at the screen. Just push through what you have and flag the anomalies later. We can't afford perfection. Mary's jaw tightened. Perfection had been her father's mantra. Precision, accuracy. It was how Belogorsk had functioned, how lives had been depended upon. The casual disregard for thoroughness, the demand for speed over exactitude, felt like a personal insult to his memory. The grief, usually a dull thrum, flared into a sharp, hot anger. Lena's flippancy, her assumption of Mary's incompetence, was intolerable. I understand your urgency, Lena, Mary said, her voice eerily calm, but I will not compromise the integrity of this data. It would be negligent. Then, taking a deep, almost imperceptible breath, she delivered the word that held a strange, potent power. Cease. Lena's mouth, already open to deliver another retort, snapped shut. Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then a dawning realization. The word, chosen in the raw aftermath of her father's death, was meant to end the contract, to sever ties with Cole. But it had also become her shield, her only weapon against the endless impositions of the new regime. It worked on freeborn members because they were drilled to respect the contract. Lena, caught off guard, visibly recoiled. Her shoulders slumped slightly. What was that? Lena stammered, clearly thrown. I said, cease, Mary repeated, her voice now firm, unwavering. This conversation, this expectation, ends now. I will complete the task to my professional standard. Do not dictate how I perform my duties. If you require it faster, provide the missing data or find someone else. Lena stared, momentarily stunned. Then, with a frustrated huff and a quick, tight nod, she spun on her heel and exited the small office, the door closing with a soft click. Mary leaned back in her chair, a shaky exhale escaping her lips. A small victory, yes, but one that left her feeling drained, the weight of her isolation pressing in. She had asserted her autonomy, but at what cost? She knew her reputation was already solidifying as difficult, uncooperative. Later that week, Mary found herself in Cole's temporary office, a large corner room overlooking the main administrative floor. He had called her in for a routine review of the new resource allocation matrix she had compiled. The air between them was always charged, a subtle tension born of their unspoken history and Mary's simmering resentment. Cole, seated behind a salvaged, heavy-duty desk, looked up from the data pad in his hands. This is meticulous, Mary, more comprehensive than I expected, given the state of the old records. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met hers, a quiet intensity in their depths. Your efficiency is not in question. But I notice you've flagged a substantial portion of the residential sector's power grid as at risk, due to what you deem insufficient power redirection. Mary straightened, her posture rigid. It is not deemed. It is insufficient. The old power conduits were designed for highly localized, industrial loads. Redirecting them to sustain residential clusters without proper rebalancing of the grid will lead to system failures, potentially widespread blackouts, within the next 3 months, based on current consumption projections. I've included my calculations and supporting historical data from the conglomerate's own records in Appendix C. Cole nodded slowly. I've read Appendix C. Your projections are alarming. But rebalancing the grid on that scale would divert vital resources from perimeter defenses and agricultural initiatives. It would take considerable time, resources, and manpower we simply don't have yet. Then you risk plunging the residential sectors into darkness, Mary retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. People will freeze in winter. They'll lose access to clean water. Is that your idea of order, Commander? Trading one kind of oppression for another? The words were out before she could temper them, raw and laced with the bitterness that had become her constant companion. She saw a flicker in Cole's eyes, a tightening around his mouth, but his expression remained impassive. Mary, Cole said, his voice soft, almost regretful. We are building something new. There will be sacrifices, adjustments. I assure you we are working to mitigate every potential crisis. Mitigate? Mary scoffed, a humorless sound. My father mitigated a shrapnel shard with his own body. He sacrificed everything for this new dawn, Commander, and all I see are new systems built on the same old compromises. Her voice rose, edged with the pain she usually kept locked away. You claim consent is the law, but what choice did I have? What choice do any of us truly have when the alternative is starvation or the freezing dark? Cole's gaze remained steady, patient, absorbing her anger. You have your word, Mary. That is your choice. You have used it before and it was respected. And it will be respected now, Mary declared, her voice trembling slightly with the force of her conviction and her grief. She met his gaze directly, her chin held high. Cease. The word hung in the air, a definitive, sharp cut. Cole's hand, which had been resting on the data pad, stilled. He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. There was no anger, no frustration in his expression, only a profound, almost weary understanding. After a beat, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Understood, Mary, he said, his voice quiet. He pushed the data pad away from him. The review is concluded. Thank you for your work. Mary turned abruptly and walked out, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had won again. She had asserted her boundary, her right to not engage on his terms. But the victory felt hollow. Cole's patience, his quiet adherence to the contract, was disarming, almost more unsettling than outright anger would have been. It made her wonder, fleetingly, if he truly believed in the ideals he espoused, or if it was just another, more subtle, form of manipulation. She didn't know which thought was more terrifying. While Mary navigated the complexities of her protected status, another, older shadow began to stir within Belogorsk. Alex Shaverin, the former head of internal security, was a man who understood power, its currents, and how to ride them. Outwardly, he was a model citizen of the new Belogorsk, volunteering for infrastructure repair, attending public forums, even offering expert advice on security protocols to the Freeborn's nascent civilian defense force. He moved with a quiet deference, a calculated humility that belied the predator lurking beneath. In the dusty, abandoned corporate supply offices, where the scent of old paper and stale air lingered, Shaverin would often encounter former colleagues, men and women who had lost their positions, their status, their comfortable routines under the freeborn regime. He'd offer a commiserating sigh, a sympathetic ear. It's a different world, isn't it, Marcus? Shaverin murmured to a former mid-level manager, ostensibly helping him sort through crates of obsolete office equipment. All these grand pronouncements, freedom, equality, yet the rations get smaller, the power flickers, and the freeborn are still just as quick to shut down dissent as the conglomerate ever was. Marcus, a man who once lorded over a team of 20, now looked pale and drawn. It's chaos, Alex, pure chaos. At least the conglomerate was predictable. You knew where you stood. Shaverin nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with a shrewd intelligence. Predictability has its comforts, doesn't it? And stability. What happens when these ideals of Cole's meet the harsh reality of winter, when the food runs out and their consent no longer feeds bellies or warms homes? He paused, allowing the seeds of doubt to take root. Cole's a true believer, I'll give him that, but belief doesn't power a city. It doesn't put food on the table. He gave Marcus a conspiratorial look. Just something to consider, my friend. We all want Belogorsk to prosper, don't we? Regardless of who's in charge. Shaverin moved through the enclave like a ghost, appearing wherever discontent festered, wherever a former loyalist felt slighted or forgotten. He'd offer a whispered word of caution here, a subtle suggestion there. To a disgruntled technician, he'd lament the Freeborn's reckless handling of the power grid, subtly reinforcing Mary's own findings, but twisting them to portray Cole as incompetent rather than principled. To a former security guard, he'd express concern about the lax, new security perimeter, hinting at vulnerabilities that could be exploited by external forces or by those within. His network wasn't built on overt rebellion, but on quiet resentment and shared anxieties. He cultivated it patiently, appearing helpful, even loyal to the new regime, while subtly fanning the flames of disillusionment. He'd learned the Freeborn's rhetoric, mimicking their phrases about shared community and collective responsibility, but always with an underlying, almost imperceptible sneer. He was a master of the double entendre, the loaded question, the seemingly innocent observation that planted a poisonous seed. "Of course, Commander Cole has his priorities," Shaverin remarked casually to a group of former administrative staff during a communal meal, his voice low enough to be overheard by others. "Establishing order, legitimacy, it's all very noble. But one must wonder, are those priorities always aligned with the welfare of the ordinary citizen, or perhaps with the welfare of a select few?" He let the implication hang in the air, watching as heads nodded subtly, faces clouded with unspoken agreement. He was a spider, patiently spinning his web, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Peter Green walked the cobbled paths of the residential sector, the cold spring air biting at his exposed ears. The uniform of the Civilian Defense Force was a muted gray, devoid of the sharp lines and insignia of his old security attire. His rifle, a standard freeborn issue, felt lighter, less imposing than the one he'd carried for the conglomerate. He was no longer a security officer, but a glorified neighborhood watch, patrolling alongside former factory workers and clerks. It was a demotion, a clear and decisive stripping of his former authority, but Peter found a strange, quiet peace in it. He was no longer part of the system he had secretly loathed. His job was to maintain peace, assist with rationing, report disturbances, a far cry from the meticulous monitoring and subtle intimidation he'd been trained for. He observed the faces of the people he passed, wary, hopeful, some still openly grieving, others adapting with a grim determination. Life under Cole's rule was leaner, less comfortable, but there was a nascent sense of community that had been absent under the conglomerate's detached efficiency. People talked to each other in the communal kitchens, shared stories, helped with repairs. It was still fragile, though, thin ice over a deep, dark pool of uncertainty. Peter's patrol route often took him past Mary Miller's residence, a modest, functional apartment like many others. He never approached, never intruded. He simply observed, a quiet sentinel. He'd seen her leaving for the administrative corps each morning, her shoulders stiff, her stride purposeful but burdened. He'd seen her return in the evenings, often after dark, her face pale under the new, dimmer streetlights. She rarely spoke to anyone, retreating into herself, her isolation a palpable aura around her. He knew about her father, Thomas. The news had spread through the enclave quickly, another tragedy in a long list. And he knew about the contract, the mark of protection. Whispers followed Mary like a shadow, Cole's protégé, some said, or the general's special case. A few even suggested a more intimate relationship, a fabrication undoubtedly fueled by jealousy and the general human need for gossip in uncertain times. Peter dismissed them. He knew the truth was far more complex, tangled in grief and an unspoken debt. One crisp afternoon, as Peter walked past a small, public garden that the freeborn were trying to cultivate, he saw Mary. She was sitting alone on a newly constructed wooden bench, watching a group of children attempting to play a game with a worn ball. Her expression was distant, almost ethereal, her eyes dark with unshed emotion. The sun, slanting through the gaps in the tall perimeter wall, cast long shadows, painting her in hues of gold and sorrow. He paused, unseen for a moment, his gaze soft. She looked impossibly fragile, yet there was a stubborn resilience in the set of her jaw. He thought of his coat, of the snow, of the stranger he had helped, and how that single, impulsive act had ripple-effected through their lives, culminating in this strange, new reality. He felt a quiet responsibility for her, a protective urge born not of duty, but of shared witness and the tragic loss of her father. The uneasy peace in Belogorsk was growing thinner by the day, and Mary, caught in the unique and isolating binds of her contract, was becoming increasingly vulnerable. Shaverin's insidious whispers had already begun to choke the communal air, turning her protected status into a visible target, her necessary interactions with Cole into something scandalous. She felt the subtle shift in glances, the hushed conversations that died when she drew near, the invisible wall rising between her and the other residents. This was no longer just the background noise of dissent. It was a targeted campaign, meticulously weaving a web around her. But the chilling edge of true isolation and the desperate measures it would demand were yet to come. As the threads of rumor tightened into a suffocating noose, Mary would soon discover that Shaverin's machinations extended far beyond mere gossip. He intended to offer her a horrifying solution, a forced alliance presented as protection, demanding a price that would test the very limits of her resolve. The fragile peace was breaking, and with it, Mary would face an impossible choice, where survival itself might demand an unbearable sacrifice. Chapter 5: Whispers and Webwork. Weeks bled into a dull, isolating current for Mary. The subtle shift in glances, once a quiet hum, had amplified into a deafening silence whenever she approached, a tangible wall rising between her and the other residents of Belogorsk. In the communal market, the vibrant chatter would dim, only to resume in hushed, darting whispers as soon as her back was turned, a name, her name, then Cole's, emerging like a venomous seed. She moved through the enclave now as if encased in glass, every movement observed, every interaction with Elias Cole, however brief or official, twisted into something illicit, scandalous. The whispers clung to her like a fine, pervasive dust. Mary, once meticulous and precise in all things, found herself shrinking, her shoulders hunching almost imperceptibly as she navigated the familiar lanes and thoroughfares of the residential sector. Each morning, she would force herself to step outside, to walk to the administrative core, past the security barracks where Peter and others now served as civilian defense. She'd observe the residents queuing for rations, the children playing in the converted park, the quiet hum of a community trying to knit itself back together. But wherever she went, the air around her felt thin, the warmth of human connection conspicuously absent. She caught snippets. Always with Cole, they say. That contract, what is it really? Some kind of affair for her protection or his? A woman, a former data analyst from her own department, quickly averted her gaze when Mary's eyes met hers across a vegetable stall, then turned to her companion, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. It was never direct accusation, never outright confrontation. It was far more insidious, a slow erosion of her standing, a quiet shunning. She was Mary Miller, the woman whose father had died, the woman protected by the rebel leader, the woman whose proximity to power seemed to twist every mundane interaction into something scandalous. The mark of protection, a subtle, almost invisible token under the collar of her tunic, had become less a shield and more a cage, distinguishing her, isolating her. She saw Alex Shaverin often, or rather, she felt his presence. He was a phantom limb of the old regime, now supposedly a model citizen, a community organizer assisting with logistics, a man seemingly rebuilding his reputation brick by careful brick. He moved through the crowds with a practiced ease, a soft smile on his lips, engaging in low, earnest conversations. But Mary knew better. She felt his gaze, a prickle on the back of her neck, a chill that had nothing to do with the still cold spring air. He was a spider, spinning his web, and Mary was beginning to realize she was very much caught in its sticky strands. She understood now that his whispers were not just gossip, they were a deliberate, calculated campaign. The weight of it, the unending scrutiny, the palpable fear and suspicion emanating from her neighbors, began to fray at her composure. Mary, who had always prided herself on her rationality, found herself reacting with unexpected bursts of irritation, snapping at Lena over a misplaced data chip, or cutting short a progress report with Cole, using the word cease with a sharp, desperate edge. He would nod, his eyes unreadable, and she would leave, feeling no triumph, only a deeper sense of her own fragile isolation. The whispers followed her even there, into the quiet hum of the administrative core, making her question every interaction, every word. Had her contractual honesty inadvertently provided fodder for their twisted narratives? One brisk afternoon, the pressure became unbearable. Mary had just left the communal market, her basket holding only a few sparse rations, feeling the usual chorus of whispers rising in her wake. She detoured from her usual path, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name, past the old corporate dorms now housing disarmed personnel. A familiar figure sat on a worn bench in a small, forgotten pocket park, largely overgrown save for a few stubbornly resilient shrubs. Peter Green, in his civilian defense fatigues, was meticulously polishing a piece of old comms equipment, his brow furrowed in concentration. His quiet presence, his very lack of pretense, suddenly felt like an anchor in her swirling anxiety. Mary hesitated for a moment, then approached, her footsteps soft on the cracked pavement. Peter looked up, his movements unhurried, his gaze direct and calm. There was no shift in his expression, no flinching away. He simply offered a small, welcoming nod. "Peter," she began, her voice a little rougher than she intended, "do you have a moment?" He set down the comms unit carefully. "For you, Mary, always." He gestured to the empty space beside him. "Rough day." Mary sat, her posture stiff, but the proximity to his quiet steadiness was a strange comfort. She took a breath, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "The whispers, they're getting louder, aren't they?" Peter's expression remained open, devoid of judgment. "They are," he confirmed simply, his voice low. "It's about you and Cole, about the contract." She clenched her fists, her knuckles white. "They say it's an affair, that I'm protected because of it, or worse, that I'm being coerced." The words were a confession, a stripping away of her last shred of composure. Do you believe them?" He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "No, Mary, I don't." There was no hesitation, no calculation in his voice. It was pure, unvarnished honesty. "I know what happened. I know Cole owes you. I know you're grieving. And I know you, Mary, you're meticulous, principled. Not someone who'd compromise herself like that, or be easily compromised." He paused, then added, "It's Shaverin's work mostly. He's always been good at this kind of erosion." A shiver ran down her spine at the confirmation, but also a strange sense of relief. Someone saw her clearly. Someone believed her. "He's still a threat," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Peter nodded. "He is. Be careful, Mary. He watches everyone. Especially you." He picked up the comms unit again, his fingers tracing its contours, but his attention remained on her. "What will you do?" Mary looked out at the bare branches of the shrubs, feeling the chill again. "I don't know. I feel trapped." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Peter didn't offer platitudes, but his continued, silent presence was a form of support more profound than any words could be. The moment felt fragile, a quiet understanding forged in the crucible of their shared isolation. The next day, a formal summons arrived at Mary's small apartment, delivered by a quiet young freeborn recruit with impeccable manners. It requested her presence at Alex Shaverin's office in the old corporate security building, an invitation that felt more like a command. Mary felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. She squared her shoulders, adjusted the subtle mark of protection under her tunic, and walked into the lion's den. Shaverin's new office was, as expected, a subtle display of renewed power. Gone were the utilitarian furnishings of the old security barracks. Now, a heavy, polished desk dominated the room, flanked by bookshelves filled with antique corporate law tomes and strategically placed maps of the enclave. He sat behind the desk, impeccably dressed in a tailored, neutral-toned suit, a sharp contrast to Cole's practical attire. The faint scent of a high-end corporate air freshener lingered in the air, a jarring relic in the freeborn era. He rose as she entered, offering a practiced, almost paternal smile. "Mary, thank you for coming. Please sit." He gestured to a chair opposite him, perfectly angled. "I apologize for the abruptness, but this is a matter of some urgency and, dare I say, sensitivity." Mary remained standing for a moment, taking him in before she finally sat, her spine rigid. "What is it, Alex?" She refused to call him Mr. Shaverin. The familiarity felt like a small act of defiance. He sighed, a sorrowful sound, and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "Mary, I've been observing, as have many. This new regime, it's unstable. And your position, I fear, is becoming increasingly precarious." "My position is secure," Mary countered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I work for the provisional government. I am protected under contract." Shaverin's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Ah, the famous contract of consent, and the mark of protection. Very novel, and very, very dangerous for you, Mary." He leaned back, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "People are talking, you know this. About you and Commander Cole." Mary felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "It's baseless gossip." "Perhaps, but gossip, Mary, in times of instability can be weaponized. It's whispered that you've been compromised, that your loyalty to the conglomerate was shed too easily. that your protection is less about noble compassion and more about a private arrangement. Or even, as some have suggested, a form of Stockholm Syndrome, a way for Cole to control you. What happens, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, when these whispers become official accusations, when the Ethelberg conglomerate eventually reasserts its authority, or even, heaven forbid, when factions within the Freeborn begin to question Cole's unorthodox methods. He paused, letting his words sink in, the implications chilling Mary to the bone. Accusations of collaboration, treason, not just by the conglomerate but by the rebels themselves. She was caught between two fires. I am simply doing my job, Mary finally managed, her voice strained. Of course you are, and a very important job by all accounts. Your data on the power grid, for instance, was invaluable, very quickly passed to me, I might add. He gave her a knowing look, implying that he'd been receiving her reports, not Cole. But Mary, appearances matter. And right now, the appearance is not good. You are isolated, vulnerable. A pawn, really, in a game far larger than you comprehend. He stood, walking around the desk to lean against its edge, closer to her. The feigned concern was almost unbearable. I have a solution, Mary, a way to legitimize your position, to silence the whispers, to give you genuine, undeniable safety. Mary's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She braced herself, instinctively knowing whatever he proposed would be vile. You will marry me, Shaverin stated, his voice calm, utterly devoid of emotion, as if discussing a business merger. It's the logical choice. It would solidify your place within the lingering corporate influence here. It would provide you with a recognized, unassailable connection to someone of standing. My reputation, my connections, my very presence here, under the guise of cooperation, would be your shield. It would shut down the rumors about Cole immediately. No one would question your loyalty if you were bound to someone like me. Mary stared at him, her mouth dry. The words hung in the air, grotesque and utterly repulsive. Marriage, to him, the man who had orchestrated this very situation, who thrived on manipulation and control. I cannot, she whispered, the word barely audible. Shaverin's smile returned, chillingly patient. Consider it, Mary. I understand this is sudden, but what are your alternatives? Remain as you are. A pariah waiting for the axe to fall from either side, or perhaps try to flee? Unwise. The tunnels are known now and the perimeter is harsher than ever. You are trapped, Mary, unless you choose to be rescued. He extended a hand, palm up, in a gesture of false magnanimity. I am offering you protection, a future, influence even, think of the stability it would bring, to you, to your standing. He didn't say your father's memory, but the implication hung heavy in the air. This was the ultimate blackmail. Use her isolation, her grief, her fear, her very reputation against her. Mary felt the bile rise in her throat. She looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his impassive face. There was no escape. She was disgusted, repulsed by the very idea, by the man himself. But the fear, cold and sharp, was a terrible counterpoint. Peter's warning, the confirmation of the whispers, the very palpable threat of being caught in the crossfire of a corporate reclaiming or a rebel purge. Shaverin had spun his web, and she was well and truly caught. She left Shaverin's office in a daze, the smell of his expensive cologne clinging to her clothes, a suffocating shroud. She walked blindly back to her apartment, the familiar corridors seeming to close in on her, pressing down, suffocating. The whispers, which had previously been an external hum, now echoed in her own mind, amplified, distorted. Once inside her modest residence, she slammed the door shut, as if she could seal herself off from the encroaching world. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls leaning in, the air thick and heavy. She paced, her steps echoing in the silence, her mind a frantic maelstrom. Marry him, Alex Shaverin. The thought alone made her skin crawl. His polite menace, his calculating eyes, the way he twisted vulnerability into a weapon. This was not a contract of consent. This was a forced capitulation, a surrender of self. But what choice did she have? She walked to the small, cracked window, looking out at the darkened enclave. The distant lights of the perimeter wall glittered like malevolent stars. Behind her, the mark of protection, the physical embodiment of Cole's debt and her so-called freedom by consent, felt like a cruel mockery. Elias Cole had offered her freedom, a right to end things with a single word. But what was freedom when the world outside that contract conspired to trap her? Shaverin was right. She was isolated. Peter's belief in her was a solitary beacon in a sea of suspicion. She had no family left. The freeborn, for all their talk of consent, were a new power, unfamiliar, and she still resented them for her father's death. Cole's protection, while genuine, had only made her a target for those who sought to undermine him. If the Ethelberg conglomerate returned, or if Shaverin's whispers culminated in a false accusation, she would be utterly defenseless. The marriage. It was a loathsome, unthinkable act, but it was also, perhaps, the only shield she had left. A visible, undeniable alliance that would silence the tongues would give her a precarious foothold in a world that sought to cast her adrift. It was a bargain with the devil, a trade of her soul for survival. But what was her soul worth if she were dead or imprisoned, her father's memory tarnished by false accusations? Her decision made, the chilling words of acceptance still echoed in the stale air. Mary would enter Shaverin's vile, manipulative alliance. She had hoped it would buy her time, a precious commodity to understand his true aims and find a way out of this gilded cage. But as the long night stretched before her, a new, unsettling truth began to solidify. The alliance was not a sanctuary, however false, but merely the first step onto a battlefield she hadn't yet seen. For survival, Mary realized, wouldn't be found in passive resistance. It would demand an active pursuit of the shadows that clung to Shaverin, the cold, calculating glint in his eyes that promised something far more destructive than political maneuvering. His whispered plans, his veiled ambitions, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were about to culminate in a horrifying symphony of chaos, and she, unwillingly, was now standing at the very heart of the orchestra. Chapter 6. A Desperate Alliance. The metallic tang of her grim decision still coated Mary's tongue when the Belogorsk dawn broke, cold and unforgiving, over her new reality. Her alliance with Alex Shaverin hadn't begun with a fanfare, but with the chilling expectation of proximity, a gilded cage with a very real lock. That morning, she found him in his increasingly opulent office, not merely organizing papers, but meticulously laying out schematics across the polished obsidian desk. His every precise movement, a silent promise of a battlefield she was only just beginning to comprehend. Already, the cold, calculating glint in his eyes hinted at a horrifying symphony, and Mary, unwillingly, was now standing at the very heart of the orchestra. Shaverin's office, once a utilitarian space for mid-level corporate oversight, had undergone a rapid, disturbing metamorphosis. The gray, modular furniture had been replaced with dark, polished wood, the standard-issue data screens now encased in brushed chrome, displaying scrolling news feeds from beyond the perimeter. Carefully curated reports from the Ethelberg conglomerate, no doubt. A heavy, dark rug silenced footfalls, lending an air of hushed authority, and a faint, cloying scent of pine air freshener clung to the air, attempting to mask the scent of ambition that reeked from every corner. Shaverin himself, always impeccably dressed, now favored dark, tailored tunics that lent him an almost military severity, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Mary, just the person. He looked up from a schematic spread across his desk, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. We need to discuss the upcoming humanitarian convoy. Protocols. Given your elevated position in my life now, it's imperative you understand the intricacies of our security measures. Mary's stomach clenched. Her elevated position was a charade, a loathsome, tactical maneuver that tied her to a man whose very presence made her skin crawl. She forced a polite, neutral expression. "Of course, Alex. What are the specifics?" He gestured to the schematic. It depicted the outer sectors of Belogorsk, with a highlighted route winding towards the main access gate, a series of red cross symbols marking the convoy vehicles. The conglomerate has finally approved an evacuation for certain loyalist families, the elderly, and the infirm. A humanitarian gesture, they claim. We, of course, must ensure their safe passage through our territory. His voice was smooth, a practiced balm, yet Mary's analytical mind immediately flagged a discord in his tone. "Safe passage implies cooperation, Alex," she said, her voice even. With the freeborn, I assume, Cole has committed to this, hasn't he? Shaverin's smile widened a fraction. Indeed, a rather fragile understanding, I admit, but one we must uphold for the optics. However, he paused, tapping a point on the schematic near the perimeter wall, we must also prepare for contingencies. The freeborn are, after all, still a nascent and sometimes volatile force. There are elements within them that might see this convoy as an opportunity, a final, grand statement against the old order. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's regulated temperature. An opportunity for what? To send a message, Shaverin replied, his gaze unwavering, cold as the winter from which he had emerged. To demonstrate their absolute control, or perhaps their absolute ruthlessness. We must be prepared for any such misstep. We can't have these families believing Belogorsk is still safe, not truly, not under rebel rule. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. Sometimes, Mary, to ensure true safety, one must allow certain events to unfold, events that illustrate the undeniable truth of a situation. Mary's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Allow certain events to unfold. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. It was the careful wording of a man planning a tragedy, not preventing one. He spoke of contingencies and missteps, but his focus was too precise, too eager. He was talking about the convoy, a humanitarian convoy, as if it were a stage for a horrific drama. What kind of missteps are you anticipating? She pressed, trying to keep her voice level, to mask the alarm spiraling inside her. Shaverin merely shrugged, a gesture of dismissive indifference that grated on Mary's nerves. Unforeseen attacks, rogue elements, perhaps even a show of force to solidify their grip on power. We, of course, will be there to protect, to respond, and to ensure the narrative is correctly perceived. He tapped the schematic again. Our drones will be monitoring the perimeter, naturally, corporate drones, but just in case, we'll have our own hidden surveillance to capture the true story. Sometimes a demonstration of vulnerability is the greatest weapon, wouldn't you agree? Mary felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Corporate drones, hidden surveillance, a demonstration of vulnerability. It was all too meticulously vague, too carefully framed. Shaverin wasn't just planning security, he was scripting a disaster. His ruthless, cold demeanor, so evident in his rise to power, was now being applied to something utterly monstrous. She managed a strained nod, excusing herself moments later, her mind reeling. The metallic scent in the office wasn't pine. It was the faint, lingering smell of blood, waiting to be spilled. The uneasy truce of the day gave way to the deep, oppressive quiet of night in Belogorsk. Mary couldn't sleep. Shaverin's words echoed in her mind, a discordant symphony of veiled threats and sinister implications. Allow certain events to unfold. Demonstration of vulnerability. It grated against her innate need for precision, for truth. Her father's death, a senseless casualty of a chaotic rebellion, had hardened her resolve against such manufactured disorder. She would not stand by while more lives were sacrificed for a power play. Late that night, Mary moved like a shadow through the silent corridors of the administrative core. Most of the freeborn personnel, unfamiliar with the labyrinthine lower levels and the myriad forgotten data hubs, rarely ventured into these dusty, neglected sections. She knew them intimately. Before the conglomerate's iron grip tightened, her father, Thomas Miller, had instilled in her a deep respect for data and an almost pathological need for thoroughness. He had taught her the backdoors, the forgotten access points, the ghost networks that still hummed with latent corporate memory. Her destination was a rarely used archive, tucked away behind a false wall in what used to be a janitorial supply closet. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale paper, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of moonlight that pierced a grimy window high above. Rusting racks of old data drives lined the walls, silent witnesses to a forgotten past. She found the terminal, a relic from an older generation of conglomerate tech, its screen a dull, flickering green. It was disconnected from the main network, a forgotten relic, but its internal logs still held a wealth of information, accessible only to someone who knew its archaic protocols and its hidden ports. Mary worked with practiced efficiency, her fingers flying across the grimy keyboard. She bypassed the standard corporate firewalls, a skill she'd honed not for malice, but for the sheer intellectual challenge of it in her former life. She began by cross-referencing recent requisition orders from Shaverin's newly established Security Logistics Department. Initially, she found nothing overtly suspicious: supplies for perimeter maintenance, standard surveillance equipment. But then she broadened her search, delving into historical data. Shaverin's past projects, his old contacts within the conglomerate's corporate security apparatus. She focused on anything unusual that might be linked to a convoy, not protective equipment, but rather something that could simulate a threat. Days blurred into nights, Mary fueling herself on cold nutrient paste and a fierce, burning curiosity. She worked in stolen hours, her official duties for Cole's provisional government providing ample cover for her forays into the forgotten corners of Belogorsk's digital memory. She meticulously sifted through archived comms logs, old internal memos detailing security protocols and emergency procedures, even forgotten drone flight path schematics. One particular set of files caught her eye, detailed schematics of the tunnels below. These were not the common service tunnels, but older, deeper mining passages, largely abandoned and supposedly sealed decades ago. Only a few longtime residents, like her father, had known their full extent. The corporate overlords, in their arrogance, had deemed them irrelevant and unsecured, focusing only on the visible perimeter. Mary found no recent official access logs, no maintenance records. Yet, hidden deep within a forgotten security override, she discovered a single, almost imperceptible modification flag tied to Shaverin's old security clearance. A ghost in the machine, indicating a theoretical breach of the seals, a bypass that only someone with intimate knowledge of the original mining operations would even know existed. It was a phantom key, hidden in plain sight. The pieces began to coalesce, forming a terrifying mosaic. Why would Shaverin, now head of security, be discreetly reactivating access to a supposedly sealed, forgotten tunnel network? And why, in a separate, obscure file from his prior corporate role, was there a procurement request for a specific, high-frequency comms scrambler, listed under experimental communication interference testing? A device capable of jamming freeborn comms, while allowing a specific, encrypted corporate frequency to operate unimpeded. It was a subtle detail, buried deep, but it screamed of premeditation. Mary's suspicion hardened into chilling certainty. She knew she was close. She just needed definitive proof. Mary found it in a hidden room, a sub-level data nexus that had been an emergency backup hub in the earliest days of Belogorsk's construction. It was an access point so obscure, so deeply buried beneath layers of obsolete security, that only an architect of the original system, or someone with her father's almost legendary knowledge of the enclave's hidden veins, could have found it. The air was colder here, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the earth. She spent another full day, methodically sifting through outdated corporate routing protocols, tracking anomalous data packets, following the faintest digital echoes. She found what she was looking for: an encrypted data burst disguised as routine maintenance traffic, originating from inside Belogorsk but routed through a server cluster hundreds of kilometers away, then back in. It was a digital ghost, designed to mislead and disappear. Hours of frantic decryption followed. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned, but she pushed through, fueled by a terrible premonition. The encryption was complex, a corporate cipher from a bygone era, but her father had taught her its nuances, its subtle weaknesses. Slowly, painstakingly, the lines of code resolved into legible text. The first few lines made her breath catch in her throat. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep reading. What she read turned her blood to ice. The decrypted communications were between Alex Shaverin and a shadowy network of what could only be remnants of corporate special forces, operating covertly within the Ethelberg conglomerate. The messages detailed, with chilling precision, the planned convoy ambush. Date, time of incident, coordinated with Convoy Bravo 7's scheduled passage. Primary objective, total annihilation of convoy and personnel. Secondary objective, discredit freeborn leadership, sow chaos for corporate reentry. Methodology, deployment of modified corporate drones, Type VII stealth variants retrofitted with freeborn insignia. Drones to engage convoy first, ensuring clear visual identification of rebel markings. Ground assault by covert corporate special forces, Phase Gamma 9 assets, disguised in hastily fabricated freeborn tactical gear to mop up survivors and ensure message delivery. Planting of fabricated freeborn manifestos and calling cards at scene. Pre-positioned signal jammers to disrupt all non-corporate communication during engagement. Shaverin's alibi, directing security response from inside admin core, providing cover for his remote coordination. Mary stared at the glowing text, a silent scream building in her chest. Total annihilation, disguised corporate drones, fake rebel insignia, fabricated manifestos. It wasn't just a plot, it was a massacre, a meticulously planned atrocity designed to frame Cole and the Freeborn, to pave the way for Shaverin's triumphant return to power under the conglomerate banner. Her father's voice, a distant echo from their final moments, whispered in her mind. Always choose the truth, Mary, even when it hurts. The truth, in this instance, was a monstrous, burning thing. The implications were horrifying. Innocent lives, families, the infirm, the elderly, were merely pawns in Shaverin's ruthless game. He was willing to sacrifice them all. Mary stumbled back to her residence, the cold dread of the unearthed truth a physical weight on her shoulders. Her small apartment, usually a refuge of ordered calm, now felt like a cage. The glow from the data screen, still burnt into her retinas, showed faces of the condemned. People she knew, people she had seen in the residential sectors, trusting, hopeful, believing in a promised evacuation. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clenched into fists, the decrypted messages replaying like a gruesome film reel in her mind. This was it. This was the precipice. She had two choices, stark and unforgiving. Choice 1, remain silent, allow the massacre to happen. Shaverin would achieve his objective, consolidate his power. She would be safe, or as safe as one could be as the fiancée of a monster. Her contract with Cole, fragile as it was, would remain unbroken. Her mark of protection might, in theory, still hold some faint glimmer of security in the coming corporate storm. But the image of the convoy, filled with unsuspecting families, being annihilated by disguised corporate forces, the blame pinned on the very people who had, however imperfectly, tried to build a new order, it was unbearable. The weight of their deaths, of her complicity, would crush her. Her father's words would haunt her forever. The first sliver of dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray as Mary finally lifted her gaze from the damning screens. The how had solidified in her mind, a terrible, desperate blueprint forged from sleepless hours and the chilling echo of innocent voices. It was a path that would demand everything, an unraveling of the carefully woven threads of her existence, but it was the only path left. She would stand exposed, vulnerable, and in that public space where her fate had once been sealed by a whisper, she would unleash the loudest shout of all. The clocks ticked relentlessly toward the scheduled convoy. In the heart of Belogorsk, a gathering would soon commence, a seemingly mundane assembly destined to become the crucible of an irreversible choice. Mary closed her eyes, picturing the faces she would see: Cole, etched with duty, Shaverin, cloaked in deceit, and the unsuspecting residents whose lives hung in the balance. With a silent prayer and a steeling of her resolve, she knew that by midday, a word, a single potent syllable would echo through the hall, shattering the quiet lies and igniting a fire that would consume them all. The time for whispers was over. The time for the broken word had come. Chapter 7, The Broken Word. The midday sun, cold and unforgiving, poured through the grimy windows of Belogorsk's repurposed corporate cafeteria, now a makeshift assembly hall crammed with a restless crowd. The air thrummed with the low murmur of residents, their anticipation a nervous current as the convoy's departure time drew closer, a clock ticking down to either deliverance or disaster. Mary stood, a shadow among shadows, near the back of the hall, her knuckles white where her fingers clenched. Elias Cole commanded the makeshift dais, his usual stoic presence challenged by the subtle gleam in Alex Shaverin's eyes beside him. The how had been a terrible blueprint. Now, as the moment solidified around her, Mary knew the time for whispers was over. The broken word, sharp and undeniable, was about to be spoken. Cole, poised at the central microphone, began to speak, his voice calm, outlining the final preparations for the convoy. We understand the anxieties, but safety is paramount. The Ethelberg conglomerate has guaranteed? No, Mary's voice, a raw, sharp blade, sliced through the murmuring hall. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it carried an undeniable force that silenced the crowd more effectively than any freeborn guard's bark. Heads turned, a ripple of curiosity and apprehension spreading through the tightly packed rows. Alex Shaverin's head snapped up, his grin faltering, a flicker of irritation, then recognition hardening his features. Elias Cole paused, his gaze, deep and searching, finding Mary in the sea of faces. Mary pushed through the thinning crowd, her steps deliberate, a current of resolve propelling her forward. The weight of her father's death, the manipulation of Shaverin, the faces of the innocent families scheduled for the convoy, all converged, fueling her courage. She ignored the whispers that flared around her, the cold looks of former colleagues who had swallowed Shaverin's poison. Her eyes were fixed on Elias Cole, her every stride an act of defiance against the chains that had bound her. She reached the edge of the dais, the space before her clearing as freeborn guards instinctively moved to intercede. Mary held up a hand, not in surrender but command. "I have something to say," she declared, her voice now clear and ringing, echoing off the high ceilings. "Something that concerns us all." Cole, despite the surprise, nodded slowly, gesturing for his guards to stand down. His gaze was unreadable, perhaps a flicker of understanding, perhaps just surprise at her audacity. Shaverin, however, recovered quickly, a sneer twisting his lips. "Mary, my dear," he purred, stepping forward, an unctuous arm reaching towards her. "This is hardly the place for—" "Silence, Shaverin," Mary cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. She faced Cole directly, ignoring Shaverin entirely. The air crackled with anticipation. This was it. The point of no return. Her chest ached with the enormity of her decision, but a fierce, purifying fire burned away the fear. She met Cole's eyes, unwavering. "You gave me a contract, Elias Cole," she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "A contract of consent, and you gave me a word." She drew a deep breath, the word a physical wrench from her very core, a severing. "My word is cease." The single syllable hung in the air, a bell tolling. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Whispers erupted, louder this time, a chaotic murmur of shock and confusion. For many, it was merely an administrative term, but for Cole and those aware of the contract, it was an earthquake. The mark of protection at her throat, the small, intricate carving, seemed to hum with silent protest, then almost imperceptibly, dimmed, its connection to him broken. Cole's face remained impassive, but a subtle clenching of his jaw, a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment, understanding, acknowledgement of her agency, betrayed the impact of her declaration. The contract, the very foundation of his philosophy, had been broken by her own choice publicly. Before the chaos could fully solidify, Mary spun on her heel, her gaze blazing, now fixed solely on Alex Shaverin. "And now," she snarled, her voice laced with an intensity that silenced the hall once more, "for the truth." She pulled a data chip from her pocket, small and unassuming. "Alex Shaverin, you are a traitor. You have plotted the massacre of this convoy." Shaverin's face contorted, a mask of outrage replacing his smugness. "Preposterous," he bellowed, his voice booming across the hall, attempting to regain control. "She's mad with grief, delusional." He turned to the crowd, his hands spread in a gesture of feigned concern. "My friends, this poor woman, she's clearly suffering a breakdown. It's the stress of these times, the burden of her father's passing." "Don't you dare speak of my father, you parasite." Mary spat, advancing on him. "You plot to murder hundreds of innocent people. Women, children, the elderly." She thrust the data chip towards Cole. "I have the proof. Encrypted comms between Shaverin and corporate special forces. Orders for total annihilation of the convoy. Modified corporate drones with freeborn insignia. Special forces disguised as your own men, Elias Cole, to discredit you." Her words hit like physical blows. The crowd erupted into a horrified roar, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and nascent rage. Freeborn guards, initially stunned, tensed, their hands going to their weapons. Shaverin's carefully constructed facade shattered, replaced by a desperate, animalistic fury. "Lies!" Shaverin shrieked, lunging forward, his hand clawing towards the data chip in Cole's hand. It's a fabrication. A desperate ploy to destabilize us. She's working for the conglomerate, a corporate spy. He turned to the crowd, his voice shrill. Don't you see? She's trying to stop your escape. She's betraying you all. Cole, with a surprising swiftness, deftly evaded Shaverin's grab, securing the data chip. He held it up, his gaze sweeping over the panicked faces of the residents. He looked at Mary, then at Shaverin, his expression grim. The truth will out, Alex Shaverin, he said, his voice low and dangerous, a stark contrast to Shaverin's hysteria. He handed the chip to Lena, a trusted freeborn officer, with a silent command to verify its contents. But Shaverin wasn't done. He pivoted, sensing the crowd's wavering trust, and pointed a trembling finger at Mary. This woman betrayed you once before. She conspired with Cole. Everyone knows the rumors. She's playing both sides, and now she condemns you to remain here, trapped. His words, though baseless, struck a chord of fear in a populace desperate for escape. A ripple of fear and suspicion swept through the crowd. Mary felt the familiar sting of their judgment, the burden of the false accusations. But this time it was different. She wasn't paralyzed by it. She had a mission. He lies, Mary cried out, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of panic. The hall was descending into chaos. People surged forward, some towards Cole demanding answers, others towards the exits, their faces etched with terror. Amidst the maelstrom, a quiet hand brushed Mary's arm. Peter Green. He was standing beside her, a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of his head guiding her eyes to a section of the wall near the back of the hall, an innocuous service door, often overlooked, leading to the administrative service tunnels. He had seen her earlier, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and had positioned himself, a guardian angel, a solid presence in the storm. Mary understood. This was the opening. Her pre-planned escape route, meticulously detailed in the stolen data logs, was active. She turned to the families who had been huddled nearest her, the elderly Mrs. Petrova, clutching her threadbare shawl, the young mother Anya, her two small children clinging to her legs, her neighbor Mr. Kirov, pale with fright. Their faces were a mirror of the innocent lives she fought to save. Follow me, Mary yelled, her voice hoarse but clear enough for those close by to hear. The tunnels, there's another way out. Shaverin means to murder us all. She pointed frantically towards the service door, urging them forward. Peter, with quiet efficiency, began to clear a path, not overtly, but with subtle nudges, positioning himself to block frantic freeborn guards from seeing Mary's small group. He was a master of inconspicuous movement, using the general panic as cover. He moved ahead of Mary, swiftly reaching the service door. His hands, practiced from his security training, worked quickly to release the old, stiff lock, barely visible amidst the swirling confusion. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty passage beyond. This way, quickly. Mary pushed Anya and her children forward, then Mrs. Petrova, their faces a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Mr. Kirov hesitated for only a second before following. A dozen or so others, seeing the opening, sensing a chance, surged after them, a frantic, desperate trickle of humanity vanishing into the darkness. Freeborn guards, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the panic and the unfolding revelation, were slow to react. Some were focused on subduing Shaverin, who continued to scream accusations. Others tried to restore order to the hall. Peter glanced back, a quick, assessing look. Mary and the last of the families were almost through the narrow opening. He could have slipped through with them. His freedom was within reach. But as Mary disappeared into the darkness, a desperate resolve settled over Peter's features. He couldn't let her take the fall, or worse, be hunted down for sabotaging the convoy. He had to buy her time. He had to draw the fire. This was his choice, born of loyalty and a quiet, profound love that transcended words. Peter turned, a calm, resolute figure amidst the spiraling chaos. He walked directly towards the dais, towards Elias Cole, whose eyes were now scanning the hall, attempting to make sense of the fractured scene. Shaverin, meanwhile, was being forcibly restrained by freeborn guards, still spitting venom. "It was me," Peter's voice, though not a shout, carried across the hall, cutting through the din. It was clear, steady, and utterly damning. Cole's head snapped towards him, his eyes narrowing. Shaverin, struggling against his captors, froze, his eyes widening as he recognized Peter. A malicious grin slowly stretched across Shaverin's face, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "It was me," Peter repeated, louder now, ensuring his words were heard by Cole, by Shaverin, by anyone within earshot. He met Cole's gaze, unblinking, his own eyes holding a fierce, selfless determination. "I helped Mary Miller." "I defied your rule, Elias Cole." He deliberately left the door to the tunnels open for the guards to see. "I provided access. I sabotaged the convoy's security protocols." The last lie, carefully chosen, was meant to be the clincher. It implied he had worked within the system to disable something crucial for the convoy's safety, drawing attention away from the real plot and the existence of the secure escape tunnels. It was a desperate gamble, a sacrifice designed to buy Mary and the fleeing family's crucial time, to give them a head start that might mean the difference between freedom and death. He knew it would brand him as a traitor to both the freeborn and the conglomerate. He knew it would ensure his capture. Cole stared at him, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. The implications of Peter's confession were immense, a direct challenge to his authority, a betrayal of the nascent trust he had tried to build. Yet, beneath the shock, a deeper emotion stirred in Cole's eyes. He had seen Peter's quiet kindness in the blizzard, his silent defiance of corporate rule. Now, here was a selflessness so profound it resonated with Cole's own fiercely held principles, a man choosing to sacrifice everything for others. It was a profound challenge to his leadership, but also a stark, undeniable testament to Peter's character. He was torn, caught between the rigid demands of justice for a broken contract and Peter's heroic, self-sacrificing act. Shaverin's grin widened, a cruel, predatory gleam in his eyes. He pointed at Peter, his voice hoarse with triumph. "There, you see, a collaborator, a traitor, a saboteur, he admits it." His accusations, originally directed at Mary, now had a new, tangible target. The freeborn guards surged forward, their intent unmistakable. The storm Peter had braced for broke over him in a torrent of cold steel and shouted commands, dragging him away from the public square, away from the last vestiges of hope he had seen in Mary's fleeing form. His sacrifice was complete, his freedom a price already paid. The gates of Belogorsk, once a symbol of his quiet existence, now stood ready to swallow him whole, a prisoner of his own unyielding truth. But even as Peter vanished into the maw of corporate justice, a faint, determined light flickered miles away, emerging from the cool earth. Mary, no longer merely a woman seeking safety, but a pilgrim burdened by loss and forged by resolve, would soon learn the full extent of Peter's forfeiture. And in that moment, her desperation would crystallize into a fierce, unwavering purpose, to navigate the desolate wastes between their shattered world and the towering spires of Viridian, to fight for the man who had given everything, and to ensure that the broken word might yet be made whole. Chapter 8. The Prisoner and the Pilgrim. The storm that had broken over Peter Green in the assembly hall was swiftly eclipsed by a far greater tempest. Even as freeborn guards dragged him towards Belogorsk's internal detention, the distant thrum of heavy engines grew into a deafening roar, signaling the return of the true masters. Moments later, the colossal gates of the corporate enclave swung inward, not to release the convoy, but to admit a phalanx of armored security vehicles. Alex Shaverin, a cold triumph etched onto his features, stepped forward to greet the incoming forces, while Elias Cole, amidst the reforming chaos, stood stoic and ready for an inevitable reckoning. Peter, now a pawn in a larger game, was immediately transferred into the harsh custody of the newly arrived corporate operatives, his freedom already a distant memory. The corporate forces moved with the precision of a perfectly oiled machine. They rolled into Belogorsk, their armored vehicles churning up dust and debris from the recent rebel occupation. Automated turrets, once silent, whirred back to life atop the perimeter wall. The air, still thick with the lingering scent of fear and smoke from the earlier confrontation, now crackled with the cold, sterile authority of the Ethelberg conglomerate. Alex Shaverin, his dark uniform immaculate despite the chaos, strode forward, his every step radiating a triumphant certainty. He met the lead corporate commander, a stern-faced officer whose insignia gleamed with the mark of the sovereign's spire, near the main gate. Shaverin's voice, though pitched low, carried an undeniable note of self-satisfaction as he gestured towards the assembly hall. As predicted, Commander. The rebel leader's governance proved unsustainable. Internal divisions, you understand. A swift, decisive collapse. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, then added, "Our intelligence indicated a mass evacuation attempt, orchestrated by Cole's most trusted men. A desperate flight ultimately thwarted." His gaze, sharp and predatory, flicked towards Peter, now surrounded by a tight ring of heavily armed corporate security being led from the assembly hall. "The ringleader of the sabotage, I presume," the commander said, following Shaverin's gaze. Shaverin offered a thin, approving smile. Indeed, Peter Green, his confession was quite clear. Elias Cole stood a short distance away, surrounded by the remnants of his freeborn guards, all of whom had lowered their weapons at his silent command. He watched the corporate forces reclaim the enclave, his face a mask of profound stoicism. There was no defiance, no regret, only a quiet acceptance in his eyes. When the corporate commander's attention finally turned to him, Cole stepped forward, his hands empty and open, a clear sign of surrender. "Elias Cole," the commander stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "you are under arrest for treason against the Ethelberg conglomerate and numerous acts of sedition." Cole met his gaze without flinching. "I anticipated as much. My surrender is offered without resistance." He paused, his eyes briefly sweeping past Peter, who was being cuffed with brutal efficiency. "This conflict," Cole continued, his voice clear and resonant, "was not without its complexities. My rule, though founded on principles of consent and truth, ultimately faltered due to a profound act of betrayal from within my own ranks." He looked directly at the corporate commander, his words a deliberate echo of Peter's earlier sacrifice. "The sabotage of the evacuation protocols, the attempt to undermine the very trust I sought to build, it was a clear demonstration of treason, even against my authority. And for that failure to maintain absolute control, for that breach of faith within my own governance, I accept full responsibility. My word, given on the terms of my own revolution, holds firm. The consequence of this treason is mine to bear. And the man responsible," he added, his gaze flicking back to Peter, "he faces his own reckoning, as is just." His words, carefully chosen, were a complex affirmation. They acknowledged Peter's treason as the ostensible reason for Cole's fall, thereby validating Peter's public confession and providing the conglomerate with a convenient narrative. But for anyone who knew the true nature of Cole's word and his debt to Peter, it was clear he was maintaining his end of an unspoken bargain, taking the ultimate fall to preserve Peter's carefully constructed lie and ensure Mary's escape. It was a surrender not of weakness, but of profound, self-sacrificing honor, a final, painful adherence to a code that transcended his own immediate fate. Peter, his wrists pulled back painfully by the thick restraints, watched Cole. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, complex mix of awe and despair. Cole's words were a double-edged sword. They condemned him, yet they also affirmed the depth of their silent pact. He kept his word, Peter thought, a cold, hollow ache settling in his chest, even at this cost. Shaverin, however, missed the nuance. He saw only triumph. His cruel smirk widened as he stepped closer to Peter, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "A loyal corporate man, aren't you, Peter? Always knew you'd find your way back to your true allegiances. Or perhaps you just chose the winning side in the end." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Enjoy the capital, Green. They have special facilities for those who dabble in treason, no matter which side they claim." Peter met Shaverin's gaze, not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet defiance. "You won't get away with this, Shaverin," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The truth, it always finds a way." Shaverin merely scoffed, his eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "Truth is a malleable thing, Peter, especially when sculpted by the right hands." He nodded to the corporate guards. "Take him, and ensure he has a comfortable journey to Veridian. Wouldn't want our star witness to be indisposed." Peter was hauled away, his body stiff, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. The last thing he saw before being shoved into a heavily armored transport was the receding figure of Elias Cole, surrounded by corporate security, his head held high, walking towards his own unknown, yet clearly grim, fate. The Belogorsk detention facility was a relic, a brutalist concrete cube buried beneath the old corporate administrative offices, designed for maximum security and minimum comfort. It hummed with the stale, recycled air of confinement, a low, oppressive thrum that vibrated through the very floor. Peter was processed with ruthless efficiency. His personal effects, a worn comms unit, a few crumpled ration bars, a tattered photo of his parents were bagged and cataloged. His civilian clothes were replaced by a rough, gray jumpsuit. No questions were asked, no explanations offered. He was a number, a statistic. The cell he was shoved into was no larger than a storage locker. Bare concrete walls, a thin, hard cot bolted to the floor, a single, flickering overhead light. The door clanged shut behind him, the finality of the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. He was alone, truly, utterly alone. Peter sank onto the cot, the rough fabric scratching his skin. The cold seeped into his bones, a mirror of the chilling despair that threatened to engulf him. He had known this was a possibility, had prepared for it, but the reality was a brutal blow. He was a prisoner, implicated in an act of sabotage he hadn't committed, sacrificed for a cause he believed in, for people he cared about. He closed his eyes, replaying the last few hours. Mary's desperate cry, her fierce defiance, the collective gasp of the crowd, Shaverin's snarling rage. And then his own words, a lie spoken for truth. It was me, I sabotaged the convoy's security protocols. The memory of Cole's gaze, that moment of shared understanding, flickered through his mind. Cole had kept his word. He had taken the larger fall, drawing the conglomerate's full attention onto himself, framing the rebel leadership as inherently flawed, and by extension, allowing Peter's lie to be easily assimilated into the corporate narrative. It was a grim kind of victory, a strategic capitulation that spared Mary and the families. A flicker of despair tried to take root. His life, his future, was gone. He was a pawn, soon to be a forgotten statistic, perhaps even a public example. He would be paraded, tried, condemned in Veridian, the conglomerate's justice system as efficient and unyielding as its corporate structure. But beneath the despair, a quiet resolve began to coalesce. He had chosen this. He had acted not out of malice but out of a deeper sense of right. He had saved lives. He had given Mary a chance. And that, he realized, was worth something. It was a costly something, perhaps the most costly thing he would ever pay, but it was not worthless. He was here in this sterile box, but he was here on his own terms. His humanity, which the conglomerate had sought to crush, had found its voice, however muted. He would face what came next with the same quiet strength he had shown in the blizzard and in that hall. He would not break. Mary stumbled out of the tunnel's mouth, the sharp, clean air of the wilderness stinging her lungs. Behind her, the other families emerged, their faces pale and drawn, a mix of exhaustion and dawning relief etched upon them. The tunnel, a forgotten artery beneath Belogorsk, had delivered them, just as Peter had promised. They were miles from the enclave, deep in a sparse, rocky ravine, far from the reach of corporate or rebel eyes. "We're safe," Mary whispered, the words feeling alien on her tongue, heavy with the knowledge of Peter's sacrifice. She turned to the young mother, whose infant daughter, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, still whimpered softly. "We need to keep moving, find shelter before nightfall." They walked for hours, their pace slow, hindered by fatigue and the fear of the unknown. The terrain was harsh, a desolate expanse of scrub brush and jagged rock formations, testament to the conglomerate's neglect of anything outside their enclaves. As dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, a lone figure emerged from the twilight, a messenger, a young freeborn scout Mary recognized, dispatched by a sympathetic guard at the tunnel's main entrance hours earlier. He moved like a shadow, his face grim. "Mary," he said, his voice ragged, "you need to know, Belogorsk, it's fallen. The conglomerate forces returned. Shaverin had them waiting." He blamed it all on Cole, on internal rebel conflict. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. "And Peter, Elias Cole?" The scout's gaze faltered. "Cole," he surrendered, peacefully, said he was upholding his word that the collapse was due to Peter's treason against his own rule. He shook his head, clearly confused by Cole's words. He gave himself up, But Peter was arrested by the corporate forces. Immediately, Shaverin himself saw to it. They're saying he's to be transferred to Viridian for trial, for sabotage, for treason. The world tilted on its axis. Cole's word. Peter's treason. It was all a tangled web of sacrifice, a complex, devastating strategy. Elias Cole had used Peter's lie to take the fall for the entire revolution, painting it as an internal collapse caused by Peter's betrayal, thereby upholding the sanctity of his own word and the terms of his initial debt to Peter. He had surrendered, accepting his fate, but ensuring Peter's manufactured guilt served a larger protective purpose. Peter had played his part, and now he was paying the price. Grief, sharp and sudden, clawed at Mary's throat. Peter in that sterile, unforgiving cage, awaiting a death sentence for a crime he didn't commit. Her father's face, then Peter's, swam before her eyes. No, not again. Not another innocent sacrifice to Shaverin's monstrous ambition. Her desperation, which had been a dull throb since her father's death, now crystallized into a fierce, blinding resolve. Her hands clenched into fists. There was only one way, one path. "I have to go to Viridian," Mary said, her voice low but steady, startling the families who huddled nearby. The young mother stared at her. "Viridian, that's weeks. It's impossible, Mary, you'll never make it." "I have to," Mary repeated, her eyes fixed on the distant, unseen capital. "Peter, he saved us. He took the blame for me, for all of us. I cannot let him pay for Shaverin's lies. I have to clear his name. I have to expose Shaverin for what he truly is." Her grief had finally transformed, not into despair, but into a focused, unyielding determination. "You all should head west, towards the old mining settlements. They're isolated but safe enough. Tell them what happened if you can, but I must go to the capital." There was no room for debate, no time for hesitation. Mary knew what she had to do. With a final, shared glance with the weary families, she turned her back on the familiar desolation of Belogorsk and faced the daunting, untamed outlands. The journey was a crucible. Days bled into weeks, each one a relentless test of endurance, ingenuity, and spirit. Mary traveled light, her small pack containing little more than a canteen, a few tightly wrapped hardtack biscuits, a worn compass, and the crumpled, brittle pages of an old Belogorsk transit map, marked with forgotten maintenance routes and disused corporate access roads. Her father, a meticulous man who had found solace in the details, had annotated it years ago, dreaming of a life beyond the enclave walls. Now, it was her lifeline. The landscapes she traversed were harsh, untamed, and eerily beautiful in their neglect. Vast plains of ochre dust stretched to the horizon, dotted with skeletal remains of abandoned industrial complexes, monuments to the conglomerate's discarded ambitions. Towering, snow-capped peaks, their lower slopes scarred by ancient, forgotten mining operations, guarded narrow, treacherous passes. Rivers, swollen with spring meltwater, roared through canyons, forcing long, arduous detours. Mary walked, her boots worn to shreds, her clothes stained with dust and sweat. She learned to read the subtle signs of the wilderness: the shift in wind before a storm, the faint scent of water in a dry gulch, the distant calls of predatory fauna. Her body ached constantly, a dull thrum of exhaustion that permeated her bones. Yet her mind remained sharp, fueled by an unwavering focus. She navigated by the stars at night, by the sun's arc by day, always pushing eastward. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her stomach, but she forced it down, rationing her meager supplies. Thirst, however, was a more insidious enemy. She scavenged for rainwater, filtered muddy puddles through her scarf, and on one desperate occasion, dug for underground springs, her hands raw and bleeding. Encounters with others were rare and often unsettling. She skirted the edges of small, isolated communities, ramshackle collections of repurposed corporate containers or ancient, forgotten farmsteads, their inhabitants wary and suspicious of outsiders. These were the outland dwellers, the forgotten people, living on the fringes of the conglomerate's control. Once, approaching a dilapidated trading post that looked like a ghost town, she was met by two gaunt figures clutching rusted rifles. "Corporate or freeborn?" one rasped, his eyes narrow. Mary, remembering Peter's advice on how to deal with wary strangers, simply held up her empty hands, her voice clear and without aggression. "Neither, just a traveler, seeking passage to Viridian, lost my way." She didn't lie, she just simplified. Sometimes, the raw honesty of her desperation earned a grudging acceptance. An elderly woman at a remote way station, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, offered Mary a small pouch of dried berries and a cup of lukewarm water, her eyes holding a flicker of understanding Mary couldn't quite decipher. Other times, she was met with suspicion and outright hostility, forcing her to flee into the night, her heart pounding. Days bled into weeks, each mile a silent prayer, each breath a stealing of resolve. The meticulous analyst Mary Miller had indeed transformed, forging herself into a weapon of truth, sharpened by loyalty and a desperate, burning hope. And then, at last, Viridian. It rose from the horizon not as a distant myth, but as a colossal, unyielding reality. A city of glass and steel reaching for the heavens, dominated by the brutalist elegance of the sovereign spire. This was no longer just a destination. It was the formidable gateway to Peter's freedom, and the crucible where a forgotten truth would either ignite or be extinguished forever. The air itself seemed to hum with the conglomerate's power, the very streets a labyrinth designed to filter and deter. To penetrate its gleaming, impenetrable facade, to navigate the suffocating layers of bureaucracy, and finally reach the enigmatic oracle at its heart, Chairwoman North, would demand every ounce of Mary's transformed being. The battleground she had envisioned lay before her, not with bombs and blasters, but with cold logic, unyielding will, and the weight of a world that had forgotten what it truly meant to be free. Chapter 9: The Oracle's Court. Viridian wasn't just a destination, Mary realized as she stepped into its humming, indifferent heart. It was a living, breathing fortress. The monumental spires she'd seen from afar now towered, suffocatingly close, each block a gleaming wall of corporate power designed to filter out the likes of her. Even the air seemed to weigh heavy with unseen scrutiny, as biometric checkpoints silently assessed every passerby, and polite, unyielding automated voices directed her towards public terminals that only offered endless, circular menus. This was her chilling first taste of the Oracle's impenetrable court, a labyrinth built not of stone, but of unyielding protocol. Weeks had passed since Mary emerged from the Belogorsk tunnels, a survivor transformed by hardship. The arduous journey had etched lines of exhaustion around her eyes and hardened the set of her jaw, but it had also forged an unshakable core of resolve. Gone was the meticulous data analyst who clung to routine. In her place stood a woman honed by desperation and a singular purpose: Peter. Her initial forays into Viridian were met with the corporate equivalent of a concrete wall. The city, a colossal monument to the Ethelberg, conglomerate's absolute dominion, pulsed with a cold, efficient grandeur that dwarfed the human scale. Glass and steel towers clawed at the clouds, their surfaces reflecting a sky that always seemed perpetually overcast with the city's self-generated atmospheric control. The streets teemed with citizens moving with a practiced, almost synchronized haste, their faces placid, eyes rarely meeting. Each intersection, every public transit hub, every building entrance was a nexus of biometric scanners and silent, unblinking surveillance lenses. Mary, still clad in the worn, practical clothing of her journey, felt like a jarring anomaly. She approached the public information kiosks, sleek obsidian pillars that glowed with corporate logos, only to be met by a series of endlessly branching, pre-recorded options. Access to internal security records. Error. Unauthorized query. Please refer to Section 3.4, Conglomerate Data Management Protocols. Request for public audience with conglomerate leadership. Query too broad. Please specify department and individual. The automated voices were always polite, always firm, always leading her in circles. She tried the human element. At a massive reception desk in the lower levels of a lesser spire, she explained, with a voice that felt too thin in the vast atrium, that she had critical information regarding the Belogorsk enclave. The receptionist, a young woman whose eyes were glued to her data slate, merely offered a curt, "All Belogorsk reports are being handled by the Central Reclamation Department. You can submit your testimony via the public portal." The portal, of course, led back to the automated menus. Days bled into a monotonous cycle of frustration. Mary ate sparingly from ration bars she'd carried, found solace in the cheap, temporary dorms provided to corporate transients, and spent her waking hours battling the system. She observed. She listened. She remembered her father's quiet lessons on navigating the corporate maze, the subtle nuances of titles and departmental allegiances. Her grief for him still a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by the fierce, protective fire for Peter. She learned that the Sovereign Spire, the colossal, obsidian-like headquarters of the Ethelberg conglomerate, was not merely an office building but a living, breathing hierarchy. Access was granted in infinitesimal increments, each floor a higher tier of authority. To reach the chairwoman's gilded chambers, she would need to ascend the entire pyramid. Mary, the meticulous data analyst, began to apply her old skills to this new, organic problem. She sifted through cached public reports, memorized the names of mid-level managers, cross-referenced departmental structures. She found a loophole, a rarely used corporate appeals process for extraordinary circumstances. It was designed to filter out frivolous complaints, but it provided a path, however narrow. I need to speak with someone in appeals oversight regarding a sensitive matter concerning regional security protocols, specifically related to the Belogorsk enclave reclamation. Mary stated with newfound authority to a bored-looking corporate guard at a lesser entrance to the Sovereign Spire. She presented her old Belogorsk employee ID, now obsolete, but still bearing the conglomerate's insignia. Her father's name, Thomas Miller, was still linked to a commendation for efficiency in resource management in a 20-year-old internal report she'd found. She used it like a forgotten key. My father, Thomas Miller, worked on the original Belogorsk energy grid. This concerns his legacy and an active security threat. The guard, surprised by the precision and the name, relented, directing her to a small, nondescript office on a lower floor. This was her first foothold. From there, Mary employed a strategy of calculated persistence. She argued her case to a series of receptionists, each one slightly less dismissive than the last. She spoke not of rebels or betrayal, but of compromised protocols, data anomalies, and breaches in corporate trust. Her language was crisp, her logic unassailable, and her presentation always accompanied by a small, encrypted data chip containing her meticulously organized findings. She knew how the conglomerate thought, in terms of efficiency, security, and the bottom line. This isn't about political ideology, she explained calmly to a weary-looking mid-level corporate secretary named Elias Vance, whose office overlooked a dizzying urban vista from the 30th floor of the Sovereign Spire. Mary had finally reached this higher tier after weeks of polite, but unyielding assault on the bureaucratic fortress. It's about a systemic vulnerability, a security threat that, if left unaddressed, could undermine the conglomerate's operational integrity across multiple enclaves. The situation in Belogorsk was not merely a rebel collapse, but a calculated internal sabotage that almost resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe. Elias Vance, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pulled-back hair and shrewd, assessing eyes, listened with an increasing flicker of interest. She had seen countless petitioners, but Mary was different. There was no emotional outburst, no desperate plea. Only cold, hard data presented with a quiet, undeniable conviction. Mary didn't beg for an audience. She presented a problem that demanded a solution that only the highest authority could provide. Mary laid out the sequence of events with chilling precision. The hidden data bursts, the procurement requests for scrambled comms, the drone modifications, Shaverin's audacious plan to frame the freeborn. She spoke of the potential for this kind of internal subversion to spread, to corrode the conglomerate from within. She subtly invoked the specter of compromised corporate intelligence, suggesting that if this could happen in Belogorsk, it could happen anywhere. Elias picked up the data chip Mary had provided, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. "You believe Alex Shaverin orchestrated this?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't believe Ms. Vance," Mary replied, her gaze steady. "I have the evidence. Peter Green's confession was a desperate act of self-sacrifice to protect innocent lives and expose a greater truth." Mary paused, letting the implication hang in the air. a truth Chairwoman North needs to understand before it unravels further. Elara Vance considered her. The audacity of this young woman, her unwavering composure, her sharp intellect. More importantly, the nature of her information, a potential internal threat of such magnitude it couldn't be ignored, especially if there was even a shred of truth to it. The conglomerate valued stability above all else, and internal rot was far more dangerous than external rebellion. Elara saw not just a petitioner, but a highly valuable, albeit inconvenient, source of intelligence. Chairwoman North's schedule is extraordinarily demanding, Elara said, her gaze fixed on Mary. But a matter of this gravity, I will see what can be arranged. Do not leave the spire. Mary felt a surge of triumph, quickly reined in. This was only the antechamber. The gilded chambers were everything Mary had imagined and far more imposing. She was escorted by silent, black-clad security personnel through corridors of polished black marble, past towering, lacquered doors, each opening into another space of hushed, intimidating opulence. The air itself felt filtered, purified, devoid of dust or imperfection. Finally, she stood at the threshold of the gilded chambers. The doors, crafted from what appeared to be solid gold alloy intricately carved with abstract corporate motifs, slid open silently. The room beyond was a breathtaking expanse of wealth and power. Sunlight, somehow amplified, poured in through vast, panoramic windows that offered a dizzying view of Viridian stretching endlessly below, like a meticulously designed circuit board. The walls were not merely gilded, but shimmered with a subtle, dynamic light, like liquid gold, making the space feel both ancient and impossibly futuristic. A massive, circular desk of polished obsidian dominated the center, surrounded by sleek, ergonomic chairs that seemed to melt into the floor. Standing by the window, contemplating the cityscape, was Chairwoman Catherine North. She was exactly as the public holoscreens depicted her, elegant, poised, radiating an aura of impenetrable authority. Her silver hair was drawn back in a severe, impeccable knot, and her tailored charcoal suit seemed to absorb the light around her. She was a woman who commanded attention not through force, but through sheer, quiet presence. Her face, though unlined, bore the subtle marks of relentless calculation, her eyes, the color of jade, missing nothing. Ms. Miller, North's voice was a low contralto, perfectly modulated, carrying just the right amount of calm authority. She turned, her gaze sweeping over Mary, a quick, comprehensive assessment that felt both detached and piercing. Elara tells me you have pressing information regarding Belogorsk and an unusual request. Mary took a deep breath, fighting the sudden constriction in her throat. This was it. Her courage, forged in the blizzard and the tunnels, had brought her to the very heart of the conglomerate. She held the small data chip tightly in her palm, a physical manifestation of her truth. Chairwoman North, Mary began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She walked forward, not stopping until she was directly opposite the obsidian desk, maintaining eye contact. I do. The information is not merely pressing. It exposes a profound vulnerability within the conglomerate's security infrastructure, orchestrated by former head of internal security, Alex Shaverin. North merely raised an eyebrow, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. A bold claim. Do elaborate. Mary inserted her data chip into a slot on the obsidian desk. Immediately, a holographic display shimmered into existence above the surface, a meticulously organized cascade of data logs, encrypted communications, drone schematics, and biometric timestamps. My investigation began when Shaverin, under the guise of offering me protection from rumors he himself propagated, coerced me into a proposed marriage. Mary stated, her voice devoid of emotion, a tactical choice to emphasize the clinical nature of the betrayal. He then revealed plans for a humanitarian convoy for corporate loyalists, but his true intent, revealed through these decrypted communications, she gestured to the glowing data, was the convoy's total annihilation. North's gaze remained fixed on the hologram, her expression unreadable. Shaverin intended to use modified corporate drones, painted with freeborn insignia, and corporate special forces disguised as rebels, to massacre innocent citizens, Mary continued, the words now flowing with a quiet, furious energy. His aim was to discredit Elias Cole's leadership, blame the freeborn, and pave the way for a conglomerate re-entry that would appear as a heroic intervention, not a tactical reclamation. She brought up the schematics of the modified drones. These are not freeborn designs. These are corporate modifications, authorized by Shaverin himself, rerouting command protocols for remote detonation. The massacre would have been horrific, a manufactured atrocity designed to sway public opinion and consolidate Shaverin's power. "And Peter Green?" North asked, her voice even, without a hint of judgment or surprise. "Your testimony states he confessed to sabotaging evacuation protocols." A convenient narrative for our reentry. Mary's eyes, bright with unwavering resolve, met North's. "Peter Green did not sabotage the convoy. He saved it. He knew I had unearthed Shaverin's plot. When I publicly broke my contract with Elias Cole and exposed Shaverin in the assembly hall, chaos erupted. Peter, without a moment's hesitation, took the blame." She paused, allowing the gravity of Peter's sacrifice to sink in. "He confessed to a lie, Chairwoman, to divert attention from Shaverin's true, far more insidious treason. He knew his life was forfeit, but he bought time for me to lead families, including a young mother and an elderly woman, through the hidden tunnels. His confession allowed the truth, and the lives it saved, to escape." Mary brought up internal security logs, showing Peter's access times and patrol routes that night, demonstrating the impossibility of him executing the sabotage while simultaneously guiding families. His actions were a selfless act of loyalty, not to a rebellion, but to human decency. He gave himself to the conglomerate's justice system to protect others, to ensure Shaverin's monstrous act would not succeed entirely. Elias Cole then surrendered, North mused, her gaze shifting back to the cityscape. He stated his rule faltered due to a profound act of betrayal. This aligns with Peter Green's confession, a rather neat package. "It was Cole's final act of consent, Chairwoman," Mary countered, her voice firm. "He understood Peter's sacrifice. He knew Peter's confession was a lie, designed to protect innocent lives and expose a greater truth. By echoing Peter's false confession, Cole validated it for the conglomerate, ensuring Peter's action would be seen as treachery against the freeborn, not heroism. He honored his word, even in defeat." It was a complex and self-sacrificing maneuver, allowing for his own capture while cementing Peter's lie, so that the real truth, the one I am telling you now, could find its way to you. Mary leaned forward slightly, her intensity palpable. "Shaverin's actions, Chairwoman, are a cancerous growth within the conglomerate itself. This was not merely an ambitious subordinate. This was a man willing to sacrifice hundreds of innocent lives and undermine the very foundation of trust within your own populace for personal gain. His ambition poses a far greater threat to the conglomerate's long-term stability than any rebel uprising. His actions were a direct assault on the principles of order and control that the conglomerate purports to uphold." North listened, her gaze unblinking. She ran a finger along the smooth edge of her obsidian desk. Her questions, when they came, were like surgical probes. "Did you collaborate with Elias Cole on this? Did he provide you access to these decrypted communications? You were under his contract of consent." "My contract with Elias Cole gave me the right to end our connection with a single word," Mary replied, her voice unwavering. "When I discovered Shaverin's plot, I broke that contract publicly, as was my right. My actions since have been entirely independent, driven by my own conscience and my unwavering belief in Peter Green's innocence. Your father, Thomas Miller, was a respected figure within Belogorsk's infrastructure division," North observed, her tone flat. "You leveraged his reputation to gain access, correct?" "I leveraged his legacy of integrity, Chairwoman," Mary countered, meeting North's gaze. "He instilled in me a fundamental belief in truth and accountability. That is why I am here, risking everything, to ensure that truth is heard at the highest level." North leaned back in her chair, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaping her lips. She closed her eyes for a moment, then reopened them, her jade gaze resting on Mary. The opulent room seemed to hold its breath. Mary could feel the weight of centuries of corporate power, the crushing inertia of protocol and ambition, poised to dismiss her. "You have presented a compelling case, Ms. Miller," North said, her voice betraying nothing. Your evidence is comprehensive, your dedication remarkable. You are either a woman of extraordinary conviction or a very skilled manipulator, or both. Mary stood firm, her spine straight. I am a woman seeking justice for an innocent man, Chairwoman, and protection for the conglomerate from a dangerous lie that threatens its very core. The hum of the golden doors faded to silence, leaving Mary utterly alone in the oracle's vast chamber, the air still thick with the immense gravity of the choices yet to be made. She stood for a long moment, the weight of Peter's life, Shaverin's treachery, and Cole's rebellion pressing down on her, a trinity of fates now held in the inscrutable hand of Chairwoman North. The oracle's final, dismissive gesture lingered, an unspoken declaration that the time for argument was over. Only judgment remained. Soon, corporate guards would return to escort her to temporary quarters within the sovereign spire, but no amount of gilded comfort could alleviate the gnawing uncertainty. Days, perhaps even hours, separated her from North's ultimate verdict, a decision that would echo through the conglomerate, granting liberty to one, sealing the doom of another, and demanding an unimaginable price from the third. For Mary, who had risked everything to speak her truth, the true reckoning was yet to come, a final word that would redefine freedom itself and forever alter the landscape of her world. Chapter 10. The Final Word. The agonizing wait in her temporary quarters within the sovereign spire had finally ended. Days, which felt like an eternity, had culminated in this precise moment. The hushed, cavernous expanse of the grand atrium. Bathed in the cold light filtering through towering crystalline windows, Mary stood among a silent assembly of corporate officials, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. On the raised platform, Chairwoman North, an unreadable figure of immense power, now stood, her presence demanding absolute silence as she prepared to deliver the verdict that would redefine Peter's life, seal Shaverin's fate, and cast Elias Cole's future into shadow. The air in the atrium was thick with anticipation, a collective held breath. The crystalline windows, usually a source of blinding light, now seemed to filter the sunshine into a cool, almost glacial glow, reflecting the frigid precision of the Ethelberg conglomerate's justice. Mary, though physically present, felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing herself from a distance. Her gaze remained fixed on Chairwoman North, whose poised figure commanded attention without a single theatrical gesture. Citizens of the Ethelberg conglomerate, North's voice resonated through the atrium, amplified just enough to be clear, yet retaining an almost conversational tone that was far more chilling than any shout. It was the sound of unassailable authority. Justice, in its purest form, is not merely punitive, it is restorative. It is the careful calibration of truth against deception and the re-establishment of order from chaos. Mary felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. North's words were carefully chosen, each syllable weighted with intent. The chairwoman paused, her eyes sweeping across the assembly, lingering for a fraction of a second on Mary before moving on. For weeks, the narrative surrounding the events in Belogorsk has been clouded by misinformation, deliberate obfuscation, and tragic loss, North continued. However, following a rigorous and exhaustive review of newly presented evidence, the conglomerate's judicial council has reached its unequivocal conclusions. A collective intake of breath rippled through the officials. Mary's hands clenched at her sides. This was it. Firstly, North announced, her voice gaining a slight, decisive edge, the former head of internal security for the Belogorsk enclave, Alex Shaverin, has been found guilty of high treason. Our investigation, prompted by irrefutable evidence of a deeply disturbing nature, confirms he orchestrated a false flag operation designed to massacre the humanitarian convoy, intending to implicate the freeborn movement and destabilize the region for personal gain. A gasp of shock, quickly stifled, went through the crowd. Mary felt a surge of grim satisfaction, quickly overshadowed by the lingering horror of what Shaverin had intended. He had woven his web, but it had ultimately snared him. Alex Shaverin has been apprehended, North continued, her gaze unwavering, and has already been transferred into the secure custody of the conglomerate's internal justice system. His ambition, it seems, ultimately consumed him. The finality in her voice left no doubt. Shaverin, once a seemingly untouchable figure, was gone, swallowed by the very system he had sought to manipulate. Mary felt a knot of tension release from her shoulders. One part of her mission was complete. Peter. Secondly, North's voice shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible softening. The individual who confessed to the sabotage of the convoy's security protocols, Peter Green, has been cleared of all charges. It has been confirmed that Mr. Green's confession was a selfless act, a deliberate sacrifice intended to divert attention from Shaverin's true plot and to facilitate the escape of innocent civilians. His actions, while technically in breach of protocol, were undertaken with extraordinary moral courage and a profound commitment to human life. A ripple of murmurs, this time of surprise and perhaps a flicker of admiration, passed through the officials. Mary felt tears prick at her eyes, a wave of profound relief washing over her. Peter, free. The thought was a beacon in the cold, cavernous space. He was safe, his name cleared, his sacrifice acknowledged. She had done it. The grand atrium swiftly emptied, corporate officials melting away like snow in the sun, their muted conversations echoing softly as they dispersed. Mary remained, a solitary figure amidst the vast space. Just as she considered her next move, a discreet corporate aide approached her, bowing respectfully. "Ms. Miller," the aide's voice was deferential, "Chairwoman North requests your presence in her gilded chambers." Immediately, Mary's heart, still thrumming with the relief for Peter, now tightened with renewed apprehension. She followed the aide, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the marble corridors, the opulence of the spire a stark contrast to the grim decisions that were being made within its walls. The gilded chambers were as Mary remembered, a breathtaking display of wealth and power, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and a faint, metallic tang. Catherine North stood by a towering window, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape of Viridian. She did not turn as Mary entered, but her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and piercing. "Mary Miller," North began, still facing the cityscape, "you have proven yourself a woman of formidable will and acute intelligence. Your evidence, meticulously presented, allowed us to unravel a conspiracy that threatened not only Belogorsk but the very stability of our system." Mary remained silent, waiting. She understood that commendation from Catherine North was not a prelude to warmth, but to cold, hard truth. North finally turned, her gaze direct and unblinking. "Peter Green has been pardoned. Alex Shaverin has been removed. This represents a significant concession on the conglomerate's part, an acknowledgement of a deep-seated corruption we would otherwise be loath to admit publicly." Mary nodded. The political implications of North's decisions were not lost on her. It was a calculated move, balancing order with the inconvenient truth she had unearthed. "However," North continued, her voice hardening, "Belogorsk was attacked. Corporate personnel were killed, resources were seized, order was violently overthrown. While your revelations regarding Shaverin mitigated the treachery within our ranks, they do not absolve the responsibility of those who initiated the rebellion." Mary's breath hitched. She knew what was coming: her father's death. The initial assault, Elias Cole. Elias Cole, North pronounced the name with a measured cadence, as the undisputed leader of the freeborn, bears the ultimate responsibility for this aggression. The conglomerate cannot and will not tolerate such defiance. To do so would undermine the very foundations of our authority and invite further chaos. Mary's throat tightened. "He believed in a different way, Chairwoman." "He believed in? Belief is irrelevant when it leads to bloodshed and anarchy, Ms. Miller," North interrupted, her tone sharp, devoid of any sympathy. "Justice, in this instance, requires a clear, unambiguous statement, a deterrent, a reassertion of absolute corporate authority." North stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Therefore, Elias Cole will face the conglomerate's full justice. He will be publicly executed." The words struck Mary like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Despite the cold logic North presented, despite knowing the risks Cole had taken, the finality of it was brutal. Her father had been a casualty of Cole's revolution, yes, but Mary also knew Cole had principles, a code. And she had, in a strange, undeniable way, come to care for him. The contract, the mark, the debt, it had all bound them in an intricate, profound way. "It is a necessary demonstration, Ms. Miller," North stated, as if reading Mary's internal struggle. "A warning to any who would challenge the Ethelberg conglomerate. It serves to close this chapter definitively." Mary swallowed, her voice a rough whisper. May I speak with him? Before?" North's gaze was sharp, assessing. For a long moment, she said nothing, then a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, as a gesture of transparency. And a testament to your role in bringing certain truths to light. He is currently in the Spire's detention levels. A guard will escort you." Mary could only nod, a wave of profound sorrow washing over her, heavy and inescapable. She had achieved Peter's freedom, but it came at a devastating cost. The transition from the opulent, sunlit, gilded chambers to the stark, unforgiving detention levels beneath the sovereign's spire was jarring. The air grew colder, heavier, devoid of the perfumed luxury of the upper floors. The pristine marble gave way to rough, unpolished durasteel, and the only light came from cold, unblinking luminaries set high in the ceiling. The silence here was not reverent, but oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the corporate guard's boots as he led Mary deeper into the labyrinthine depths. She was stopped before a reinforced durasteel door, featureless save for a small, barred viewport. The guard indicated for her to look through. Elias Cole sat on a narrow cot in the center of a small, featureless cell. He wore a simple, coarse gray tunic, stripped of all personal effects. The raw, unfiltered light of the cell made his face seem etched with fatigue, but his posture was straight, his shoulders broad. He looked up at the sound of their approach, his eyes meeting hers through the thick viewport. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a profound, almost weary acceptance. The weight of weeks, the fall of Belogorsk, his imprisonment, it was all visible in the subtle lines around his eyes, but his spirit remained unbroken. His eyes, direct and unwavering, held a depth that spoke of battles fought and principles upheld to the very end. The guard unsealed the door with a low hiss, allowing Mary to step inside. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing ominously in the confined space. The air was cool, sterile, yet Mary could almost smell the faint, lingering scent of damp earth and the unique, clean aroma that was distinctly Cole. They stood for a long moment, the silence between them charged with unspoken history, with complex emotions that defied easy categorization. Grief, gratitude, the specter of what could have been. The debt, the contract, the shared principles. Mary finally found her voice, a fragile whisper. "Cole." He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Mary, you're safe. Peter?" "Peter is pardoned," Mary confirmed, her voice cracking slightly. "Shaverin, he's gone. You knew, didn't you? That Peter's confession, your surrender, it was all part of getting the truth here." A faint, knowing smile touched Cole's lips, a flash of the man who had stood so calmly amidst chaos. "I trusted your word, Mary, that you would see it through. That you would find a way to let the truth breathe." His gaze drifted to her throat, to where the mark of protection had once pulsed with its faint, internal light. It was gone now, its binding power broken the moment she had spoken cease in the assembly hall. I'm so sorry, Elias," Mary choked out, the formality of their names momentarily forgotten. "For this, for everything." The tears, held back for so long, finally welled in her eyes. This wasn't just sorrow for his impending death. It was a deep ache for the principles he stood for the impossible hope he had offered, and for the complex, undeniable connection they had forged amidst the ruins of Belogorsk. Cole took a step closer, his eyes gentle but resolute. "There is nothing to be sorry for, Mary. This was always a path I chose, with my eyes open. I live by my word, and I die by it. The contract, it was always about freedom. Yours," he reached inside the coarse tunic, pulling out a small, intricately carved wooden disc. It was the mark of protection, the symbol that had bound them, that had marked her. It felt warm in his palm. He held it out to her. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, a jolt of raw emotion passing between them. His touch lingered, a final, silent communication of respect, of a profound, unspoken understanding. It wasn't love in the conventional sense, not anymore, but something deeper, forged in fire and shared sacrifice. It was an acknowledgement of kinship, of two souls who had, in their own ways, sought to uphold a higher truth. "Your freedom," Cole said, his voice soft, yet resonating with an unyielding power that defied the sterile confines of the cell. His eyes held hers, unwavering, filled with a serene certainty. "By your word." His gaze held hers for another long moment, a lifetime passing between them before he took a step back, the silence falling heavy once more. The guard, sensing the unspoken signal, pushed the door open, a silent command for Mary to leave. Mary clutched the mark of protection, its smooth surface now cool in her trembling hand. She turned, walking backward slowly, her eyes locked on his, until the door clanged shut, severing the connection, leaving her with the weight of his final, profound words and the unbearable finality of his sacrifice. The capital city's grim execution yard was a stark, open plaza dominated by a raised platform, crudely constructed for maximum visibility. The sky above was a dull, featureless gray, matching the subdued mood of the few onlookers allowed to gather, mostly uniformed corporate officials and a handful of carefully vetted citizens. The air was still, heavy with a silent dread. Mary was not among the onlookers. She was back in her temporary quarters, the small wooden mark of protection clutched in her hand, but in her mind's eye she could see it, feel it. Elias Cole was led onto the platform, flanked by 2 anonymous corporate guards. His head was held high, his gait steady. He did not look at the assembly or at the sparse crowd. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, perhaps on the memory of the snow-covered peaks of Belogorsk or on the vision of the truly free world he had fought for. He made no statement, offered no defiance. His acceptance of his fate was absolute, a final, unwavering act of adherence to the principles he had lived by. He had given his word, and he would die by it, a man utterly true to himself, even unto death. The execution itself was swift, brutally efficient, designed to be a chilling lesson rather than a spectacle of agony. A sharp, mechanical sound, a brief, almost imperceptible tremor, and then silence. Elias Cole, the leader of the freeborn, the man who had given Mary a contract of consent and a mark of protection, was gone. His legacy, however, was not extinguished. It lived on, not in the triumphant reassertion of the conglomerate's power, but in the quiet, profound meaning of his final words. The echoes of Elias Cole's final, defiant words, "Your freedom by your word," resonated through the suddenly quiet, hollowed halls of Belogorsk. Mary, standing alone in the sanctuary of her room, the transformed mark of protection warm against her palm, felt the truth of them settle deep within her bones. The chains of fear, of obligation, of unspoken contracts had shattered. She was finally truly free, not by decree, but by a choice forged in fire, a choice to live by her own convictions. The violent storm that had ripped through the city had passed, leaving behind a scarred but silent landscape, pregnant with an uncertain future. But freedom, Mary knew, was not an ending, but a daunting beginning. The void left by Cole's death was a gaping wound, threatening to swallow Belogorsk whole or reshape it into something new and perhaps more terrible. Yet, even in the pervasive uncertainty, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl, whispering of a path towards healing, towards rebuilding, towards the quiet, profound strength found in mutual consent. What would it mean to truly live by one's word, not just for herself, but for a city yearning for redemption, for the very people she held dear, still scattered by the storm? The dawn was yet to break over Belogorsk, but Mary knew, with a certainty that hummed in her veins, that the true work was just about to begin. Chapter 11. Dawn of Consent. The oppressive stillness that had settled over Belogorsk after the sovereign spire's final verdicts slowly began to fracture, replaced by the tentative hum of a city stirring from a long, painful slumber. Weeks had unfurled since Mary had stood in her room, Elias Cole's last words echoing the profound weight of her newfound freedom. Now she stood instead before the imposing, newly unbarred gates of the Belogorsk detention facility, the morning light, a pale, promising gold, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, her gaze fixed on the quiet steel door. A figure emerged, a silhouette against the rising sun, and Peter Green stepped into the burgeoning day, his eyes, weary but resolute, finding hers across the sterile courtyard. Peter walked slowly, as if testing the unfamiliar feel of open air, his movements still carrying the stiffness of long confinement. But the moment his gaze met Mary's, a faint smile, genuine and unburdened, touched his lips. He wore simple civilian clothes, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd last worn. Mary felt the mark of protection, still clutched in her hand, warm against her palm. She hadn't dared wear it, not yet, not here, not so soon after Cole's final words. It felt too sacred, too heavy with the weight of sacrifice and promise. He reached her, and in the quiet space between them, words felt inadequate, almost vulgar. His eyes, though shadowed by the ordeal, held a clear, unwavering light, the same quiet integrity she had always known. She saw the lines of exhaustion around them, the subtle hollowness in his cheeks, but beneath it all, the unshakable core of the man who had laid his freedom on the line for her. "Peter," she whispered, her voice thick with the emotion she had held tightly for so long. He simply nodded, his smile widening slightly, and then, without further hesitation, he reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that was both tentative and infinitely strong. It wasn't a desperate, clinging hug, but a quiet, deeply felt joining of two souls who had walked through fire for each other. She leaned into him, feeling the solid comfort of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. It was a silent acknowledgement of the crucible they had endured, the immense sacrifices they had both made, not just for each other, but for the elusive truth. In that moment, the sterile courtyard, the imposing facility, the echoes of past trauma, all faded, replaced by the profound, unspoken language of their shared understanding. "Free," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough. "Truly free." Mary nodded, her eyes closed, burying her face in his shoulder. "Because of you," she whispered back, the words a silent promise of everything that was to come. Belogorsk was a city of ghosts, slowly learning to breathe again. The hum that had replaced the stillness was the sound of hammers on wood, the scrape of brushes on damaged walls, the low thrum of newly re-established power grids. Weeks bled into months, and the harsh winter chill gave way to the tentative warmth of spring, then the burgeoning heat of summer. Signs of conflict remained: pockmarked walls, boarded-up windows, the occasional vacant stare in a resident's eyes. But beneath it all, a new life pulsed. Under Chairwoman North's cautious oversight, a new provisional government had taken root, one that felt markedly different from Cole's brief, radical tenure or Shaverin's predatory control. There was a sense of deliberate, measured rebuilding, a careful filling of the power vacuum with a greater emphasis on local input. Community meetings, once a rarity, became a weekly occurrence, held in the newly repaired Assembly Hall, its metallic tang of disinfectant slowly fading, replaced by the sense of fresh paint and hope. Mary found herself drawn into the heart of this recovery. Her name, once synonymous with scandal, now evoked a quiet respect. People approached her, tentative at first, then more openly, seeking her insights, her methodical approach to problem-solving. She moved through the recovering enclave, observing the changes, the efforts to re-establish essential services, the tentative smiles exchanged between neighbors. She was no longer just a data analyst, or a corporate pariah, or even a reluctant hero. She was quietly becoming a guide. One evening, at a bustling town hall, the air thick with the murmur of voices and the shared purpose of reconstruction, Mary stood before the community. She had been asked to speak on the principles of equitable resource distribution. Peter sat in the front row, his presence a steady anchor, his gaze affirming. "We stand at a crossroads," Mary began, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the large hall. "We've seen what unchecked power can do, both within the conglomerate and in the aftermath of its collapse here. We've learned, often painfully, the cost of silence, the price of unquestioning obedience." A few nods rippled through the crowd. Mary paused, her eyes scanning the faces, seeing the echoes of their shared experiences. "Elias Cole," she continued, speaking his name with a new, complex reverence, was a man of radical ideals. He spoke of a contract of consent, of truth, of freedom by your word. In his methods, there was violence, yes. But in his vision, there was a core truth that we cannot ignore. She held up her hand, the faint indentation of the mark's edges still visible on her palm. "This mark," he said, "was a symbol of my freedom, your freedom by your word. And by my word, I broke his contract, not to defy him, but to uphold a deeper truth." She lowered her hand. "We are building something new here, something resilient. And its foundation must be built on those very principles: radical honesty in our dealings, transparency in our governance, and above all, consent in our collective decisions." Every voice must be heard, every person's agency respected. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine, undeniable choice. This is not just a framework for governance. It is a way of life, a promise we make to each other. The hall remained silent for a moment, then a slow, scattered applause began, building in strength. People looked at each other, a quiet understanding passing between them. Mary wasn't dictating, she was advocating, inviting them to participate in the construction of their own future. It was a concept both alien and profoundly appealing after a lifetime of corporate command. Peter met her gaze, a deep sense of pride in his eyes. He saw the woman she had become, powerful not through force, but through integrity and conviction. Their shared residence was a modest apartment in the revitalized residential sector, the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby communal kitchen often drifting through the open window. It was a space they had carefully curated, simple but filled with the quiet comfort of their shared existence. They had chosen it together, piece by piece, a conscious act of building a home. One evening, as twilight settled, painting the room in hues of soft orange and purple, Mary sat with Peter on a worn but comfortable sofa. A holographic map of Belogorsk shimmered on a nearby table, displaying the progress of the rebuilding efforts, new green zones marking restored parks and community gardens. "It's happening," Peter said softly, tracing a finger along the map's contours. "The change. It's slow, but it's real." Mary leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the familiar, grounding strength of him. "It has to be," she replied. "We can't go back to the way it was, not after everything." She paused, a thoughtful silence settling between them. "Do you ever regret it, taking the blame, coming here?" He turned his head, his chin resting lightly on her hair. "Never," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "When I stood there, watching you lead those families to the tunnels, knowing I was buying you time, that was the truest thing I've ever done. It was my choice. My word." He shifted, gently turning her to face him, his hands resting on her arms. "And coming back, building this with you, it's a life I never dared to imagine. A life where I can be truly myself. Truly free." Their love, forged in the blizzard's embrace and refined in the fires of betrayal and sacrifice, was not a whirlwind romance. It was something far deeper, anchored in mutual respect, quiet understanding, and an absolute commitment to each other's agency. There were no demands, no unspoken expectations, only invitations. Their kisses were tender, their touches gentle, infused with the unspoken knowledge of what they had endured. It was a love that had known the scars of loss, the weight of despair, but emerged stronger, more profound, precisely because it was built on a foundation of absolute consent, freely given and continually affirmed. "You've changed Belogorsk, Mary," Peter said, his thumb stroking her arm. "You've given it a voice, a path." Mary shook her head. "We have. It's not just me. It's all of us choosing to build something different, something based on the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "And I couldn't do it without you. You're my compass, Peter, my anchor." He smiled, a quiet, profound smile. "And you're my North Star, Mary, always leading towards something better." He supported her vision not out of obligation, but out of a shared belief in the principles she championed. He was her steadfast partner, a testament to the quiet strength of consensual partnership. Months turned into a year, then two. Belogorsk, once a stark corporate enclave, blossomed into a community defined by its burgeoning autonomy. The perimeter wall, though still standing, now felt more like a protective boundary than an oppressive cage. Its automated turrets replaced by community-managed surveillance, its gates opening for carefully monitored trade and humanitarian aid. The admin core, Elias Cole's former headquarters, was now a public forum, its grand hall often filled with residents debating, designing, and deciding. Mary stood once more in that central communal space, the assembly hall. It was no longer sterile, but alive with the textures of hand-woven tapestries, the scent of earth from the new indoor garden cultivated by community members. Children, unburdened by the fear their parents had known, played quietly in the corners. Today, the community had gathered to ratify the new Belogorsk Charter of Consent, a document drafted through countless meetings, debates, and compromises, a living testament to their shared purpose. As she prepared to speak, Mary reached into her pocket and pulled out the intricately carved wooden mark of protection. It felt lighter now, no longer a symbol of debt or protection bestowed, but of a freedom hard-won and self-actualized. She remembered Cole's weary, resolute face in the detention cell, his final words echoing, "Your freedom by your word." He, the rebel leader who had been both a killer and a man of unwavering honor, whose methods had been violent, but whose core philosophy of consent had been profoundly transformative. His complex legacy, once a wound, was now a bittersweet source of strength. He had been a catalyst, a brutal and necessary force, whose radical ideas of agency had paved the way for something genuinely new. "We stand here today," Mary began, her voice clear and resonant, holding the mark aloft for all to see, not as subjects but as citizens. "This symbol," she said, gesturing to the mark, was once a representation of a unique contract. But its true meaning, as Elias Cole ultimately taught me, is far greater. It is the freedom to choose. The freedom to speak your truth, the freedom to live by your own word." She lowered her hand, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the hall, Peter's quiet, supportive presence among them, the familiar faces of the families she had led through the tunnels, the new faces of those who had chosen to make Belogorsk their home. "Consent," Mary declared, her voice ringing with conviction, "is not merely the absence of coercion. It is the active, ongoing presence of choice. It is the understanding that every voice holds value, that every boundary is sacred, that every relationship, every agreement, every step we take as a community must be founded on mutual respect and shared will. This is the law we choose for ourselves. This is the dawn of consent." A wave of profound affirmation rippled through the hall. Heads nodded, hands reached out to clasp others. The community embraced these principles, not as abstract ideals, but as the lived reality they were building, day by slow, deliberate day. The silence that followed Mary's words was not empty, but full, filled with the promise of a future where true freedom was not granted by an authority, but forged by the collective will of its people. Belogorsk was a beacon now, small but resolute, a testament to the enduring power of choice, of truth, and of the radical idea that genuine connection, whether between two people or an entire society, could only truly flourish in the bright, clear light of consent. The future stretched before them, not a preordained path, but an open horizon waiting to be shaped by their word, by their choice together.
Thank you for listening to this Soundscape Books recording of The Sovereign Word, a dystopian sci-fi novel written by Vivian Black. We hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe so you don't miss our new releases. Goodbye for now.